The desert enforced a deep interiority. There was nothing to see beyond the slow curve of the horizon. Nothing. To hear beyond the soft rush of the windmen, thought of their homes off the texture of a stone wall off, the sound of a loved one's voice, memories becoming sharp and clear like drawings, etched deeply in stone. The afternoon march began with the same slow effort. The guides roused the camels, the great beasts complaining loudly, a deep, mournful rumble that shook the ground then. The slow folding of the limbs, the careful wristed weight settling once more upon the spines. The sun began its long, slow descent. It was still fiercely hot, but the light was changing, subtly gaining a richness. A profound golden hoof painted the sand. Dunes and contours of fire, the shadows returned along its head stretching. Out ahead of the caravan pointing toward the unseen evening camp, the afternoon was always the hardest. The body was tired, the reserves low. The mind struggled against the monotony one. Foot after the others, slow, inevitable sway of the inner mouth. Heavy scent of sweat and salt. The desert demanded pure persistencia, refusal to notice the distance traveled. We passed through a region of rock. Formations since weathered things standing. Like forgotten sentinels, their surfaces were dark red and black polished, smoothed by the ceaseless wind. They looked like the ruins of a giant city, silent, cold, indifferent to the passing trade. One of the younger guards spoke, softly pointing to an etching. On a flat stonia, small crude depiction of a deer, perhaps a mountain goat made by hands that had kind of shed thousands of seasons ago. Road was not merely space, it was time layered deep. Each step we took was upon the ghost off 1,000 previous journeys. The Sagin mastered Nasrullah, his face cloaked in heavy linen, nodded slowly when the guard pointed. He knew these markers, they were the only landmarks that never changed. The shifting sand covered and revealed them, but the stone endured a quiet, constant in the fluid desert. He spoke then, his voice low and dry like wind passing over grit. He told the guard that the purpose of the long journey was not simply to move goods, but to learn the virtue of slowness. The silk must not be rushed, jade must not be jostled. The desert punished eagerness, it rewarded patience. Quality of the silk was paramount. In those hidden bales we carried the dreams of empresses and kings far to the west. The threads had been spun in the deepest east, in places of legend where the mulberry trees grew thick and the air was humid and gentle. Now those threads were subjected to the desert's violence, protected only by the skill of the packer and the steady pace of the camel. We carried bolts of shimmering crimson deed with the precious scale, insect and rolls of deep imperial yellow reserved. For the royal cordon links of soft pale moonlight white tesso. Sheer they felt like mist in the hands. They were wrapped tightly. Secrets held close to the chest, their value increasing with every slow mile. Imagine the velvet touch of the cloth, way it slipped like water over skin. A luxury, almost incomprehensible. The dust-caked reality of the caravan. This contradiction, sustained. But journey's promise of overwhelming softness carried by overwhelming roughness as the sun began its final slow dipped world, transformed. The light became liquid gold, turning to rose. Fine sand caught the low race and the dunes glowed with impossible warmth. The temperature dropped quickly, a wave of soothing coolness washing over the tired. And then this was the golden hort brief window of profound peace. Bear the serious business of setting camp began. The day's travel was nearing its end. We could hear the guides exchanging low calsignals of the chosen resting place. Tonight, we would camp near a low ridge of footing. Minimal protection from the night winds, but providing firm ground free from the risk of sudden sinking sand. The caravan halted. With the usual collective sigh, sounds of relief echoing across the silent basin, loading was careful and methodical each. Bale was accounted for, checked for any sign of shifting or damage. The men moved with a practiced grace, their movements fueled by the need for rest, yet tempered by the absolute necessity of protecting the cargo. Camels were given their hard, dry feed. A slow, deliberate process of sustenance. They were allowed to roam slightly, their long ropes anchored to heavy stones. Their great dark shapes settled quickly, bemming of the landscape. They exhaled deeply, a rumbling satisfaction at the close of the long days. Marked small fires were lit slow using dried camel dung and scrub collected carefully during the last hour of travel. The smoke rose, thin and straight, a fragile pillar against the darkening sky. smelled sharp, and eartheth smell of warmth and security. Dinner was simple and slow-dried meat, salted hard bread, and weak. Tea boiled slowly over the reluctant flames. The men ate sitting cross-legged in a loose circle through their faces, illuminated by the flickering firelight etched with shadow and relief. The desert night descended quickly, peeling a heavy cloak of indigo and violet over the world. Temperature continued to plummet, forcing the men to pull their heavy robes tighter. The air became crisp, clean, almost sharp. The guards took their watches. First shift moving out to the perimeter, carrying long, heavy spear sand bows ready strung, though the desert seemed empty. It was never truly deserted. There were always eyes watching from the distant blacknesses, hungry for the slow-moving wealth. Nasrullah, the master merchant, sat apart, his figure cloaked, and still he looked up at the immense sky, now entirely black and glittering. The desert stars were overwhelming, a spill of endless diamond dust across a velvet canopy. He did not need maps of leather or parchment. The stars were his map. A slow rotation of the celestial sphere told him the hours and the direction. He could trace the path of the pole star with steady fixed light that offered constant sign, a world of constant change. He was calculating the distance traveled not in leagues or miles, but in days, endured in the quality of the sand passed over in the consistency of the morning. Chill the journey measured time not by clocks, but by the slow growth of patience. He thought of the road ahead, the mountain passes yet to be foresaid, narrow tracks high above the clouds where the air would be thin and biting and the mules would replace the camels for a difficult month of upward toil. But that was tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. Tonight was for rest, for the profound quiet of the deep desert. The only sounds were the slow breathing off the sleeping meant, the soft rustle of the cooling fire in the vast endless silence of the sleeping world itself. The fire settled into low glowing coals, a comforting circle of orange light against the impenetrable blackness. The men wrapped themselves tight, each seeking the warmth of the close earth. Cold seeped into the ground, but the warmth of the day lingered just beneath the surface. Sleep came easily, a slow, welcoming darkness, a release from the tyranny of the soon and the endless demand of the sand. Journey continued even in sleep, slow, rocking motion of the camel persisting in the subconscious minda, gentle, steady movement lulling the soul deeper into rest, deeper. And slower the world turned. Stars watched the long, slow progress off the Silk Road, caravan moving always toward the distant unknown west, moving slowly through the ancient dust. The air grew thinner still around the scroll of hammered copper, a metal impossibly thin yet carrying the weight of ages. Alistair's fingers traced the cold etched lines. The symbols were not common script, but twisting roots sinking deep into the bedrock of the world. He saw on the copper map not corridors but layers of silence. Each line represented a downward spiral, a deeper forgetting. His lantern cast an amber glow upon the middle surfaces, illuminating a path that defied logic, a straight drop followed by an inverse dome of stone. This archive chamber was hushed, now truly hushed. The sounds of his own breath were intrusive echoes in the void. He saw the destination marked by a single stylized eye. The sunken eye, it seemed to stare back from the map itself. He knew then the library was merely the antechamber. The city of Ethel stretched not outward, but down into the eternal cold. He rolled the copper carefully, binding it with thin leather cord, the ancient artifact heavy in his hand, not physically, but metaphorically. The stone floor felt slick beneath his worn boots, velvet with accumulated dust, years of undisturbed stillness. He turned away from the shelved secrets toward a darker opening previously missed, cloaked entirely by a hanging sheet of petrified leather. He pushed the brittle shield aside, revealing a narrow passage, carved roughly hewn, not polished like the chambers above. This felt older, more primal to work of hands seeking refuge, not glory. Passage descended sharply, the steps uneven, treacherous. Moved slowly, measuring each footfall, remembering the instructions. The warnings whispered on the surface ages ago about the architecture that defends itself. The air here smelled of iron and deep earth. It was a profound and mineral silence, broken only by the steady drip, drip, drip of water gathering somewhere far below. He passed a sequence of doorways, each sealed with immense fitted stone blocks. They were not merely closed, they were ritually stopped, the cracks sealed with a pale green mortar that shone faintly under the Lampy wondered what terrible knowledge, what sleeping dread they were meant to contain. Further down, he moved the cooler. The air became not simply cold, but chillingly stagnant, like air trapped before time began. He paused, setting the lantern on a low shelf carved into the stone, pulled out the copper map, verifying his position against the faint etched markings on. The passage walls barely visible. He recognized the symbol of the coiled serpent, a sign of descent and transformation. The map showed a sharp turn coming soon, leading to a colossal chamber, referred to simply as the Cradle of Sleep, a title that offered no comfort. He extinguished the primary light, briefly plunging the entire space into absolute midnight to rest his eyes and recalibrate his senses. The darkness was immediate, thick, suffocating. In that profound blackness, he heard it first, not a sound of movement or stone falling, but a vibration and hum that traveled through the soles of his feet up into his bones. It was not the earth settling. It was something being sustained, something living or perhaps enduring. He lit the lantern. The amber light chasing back the velvet shadows, the vibration faded, but the memory of its presence lingered, a phantom. Pulse in the stone, he continued his descent, the passage widening, now into a vast natural cavern, only lightly shaped by human hands. The ceiling disappeared into the blackness above, too high for the light to touch. He walked along a narrow ledge bordering an abyss, shone the light down, finding nothing but emptiness, a yawning darkness that swallowed the beam entirely. This space felt wrong, untethered from the world above. He focused on the wall beside him. Ancient carvings covered the stone figures of beings tall and lean, with elongated limbs. Their heads bowed in eternal contemplation. They seemed to be walking ceaselessly downward, toward a focal point that Alistair could not yet see. He realized these were not mere decorations. They were directional markers, a guide for those who had already accepted the deep journey. The path curved, suddenly leading to an enormous archway of dark gray basalt. It was smooth, perfectly carved, unlike the rough passages surrounding it. This was the entrance to the inner sanctuary, the place where the map promised resolution, or perhaps ruined guardians stood on either side of the archway effigies. Carved from solid granite, cloaked in silent robes, their faces were worn flat by the attrition of time, their eyes empty sockets that seemed nevertheless to watch him pass. He felt the prickle of awareness that he was trespassing on an intentional silence. He moved past them, the air now growing heavily scented, not with dust, but with something metallic and sweet like dried blood and crushed moonflower. He stepped through the archway and into the Cradle of Sleep. It was not a cradle at all, but a circular chamber of immense size, its floor polished obsidian reflecting the weak lantern light perfectly. In the center stood a single monolith, a column of pure white marble streaked with veins of silver. It was impossibly bright within this dark subterranean space. Approached the monolith carefully, his boots scraping lightly on the hard floor. He saw that the stone was etched with thousands of minute symbols, scripts he had never encountered before, flowing like water down the surface. He reached out a trembling hand to touch the marble. It was radiating a subtle coldness and energy that felt balanced and immense. Noticed a small indentation at the base of the monolith, shaped exactly like the copper scroll he carried. The stone demanded its map back. Alistair hesitated, the ultimate step requiring a sacrifice of his only navigational guide. But the curiosity, the obsessive pull of Ethel's final secret was too strong. He unrolled the copper map, smoothing the edges, and slowly fitted into the indentation. Slid home perfectly, locking into place with a soft hydraulic sigh as the copper touched the marble. The entire chamber responded. Low pulse of light erupted from the monolith, changing the amber of his lantern to a strange pale blue. Light was not harsh, but illuminating, revealing the true scale of the chamber. Walls were lined with alcoves, and within each alcove rested a figure. They were not statues. They were preserved bodies encased in a crystalline substance, transparent and cool. The whisperers, he thought, realizing the terrifying truth. These were the inhabitants who chose to sleep rather than flee the coming doom. They lay in repose, cloaked forever in their glassy tombs, their expressions peaceful yet profoundly distant. Their eyes were closed, their hands crossed over their chests, holding small, smooth river stones. Alistair walked among them, his breathing shallow, the air thick with the suspended essence of ages. He felt an overwhelming pressure to join them, to lay down his own burdens and slip into the crystal sleep, but the blue light emanating from the monolith was growing stronger, pulling his focus back to the center of the chamber, where the copper map now sat fused to the white marble column. A new opening appeared. A dark seam split the floor beneath the monolith, revealing a circular staircase winding down into unimaginable depths. The map had shown him the way, but had not prepared him for the final descent. He peered over the edge into the blackness. The blue light failed to penetrate this final void. The hum returned stronger, now vibrating the marble floor beneath his feet. It was not a machine sound, it was organic. It sounded like a voice stripped of all vowels, a fundamental frequency. Alistair knew this was the destination. The sunken eye grasped his lantern, checking the oil, realizing he had just enough light for the final minutes. He placed one foot on the first descending step. It was colder than anything he had felt before, a freezing shock that seeped through the thickest leather. Started down the staircase, winding slowly around the central column, which now seemed to stretch miles above him. The whispers above were forgotten. Now only the sound and the cold mattered. Went down and down, counting the steps, but losing track in the profound darkness. The air grew sharp, metallic cold. The hum intensified, warping into something almost recognizable, a slow, measured sound that seemed to be counting time. He stopped clutching the cold stone railing. He tilted the lamp downward, trying to find the bottom. The light caught something reflecting strangely from the infinite. Distance below it was a shimmer, a movement that defied explanation. It was not water or rock or fire. It was a slow rotation of something vast and entirely invisible in the darkness itself. And from that invisible turning object, a new sound began to rise. It was a soft melodic ringing, distant and utterly beautiful. A sound not of lamentation, but of patient waiting. Alistair leaned further into the dark, the cold biting at his exposed skin. The ringing grew louder, sweeter, almost like glass spheres, rolling across polished stone, forever out of sight in a deeper silence. The desert breath held, still, a slow sigh escaping the sand. Just before dawn, a deep, dark, velvet coolness still pressed against the skin, a memory of the mountain ice, long left behind, a blessed reprieve before the sun came back to claim the sky. Only the low sound of the breathing, the vast collective breathing of 100 patient camels, waiting for the first word, waiting for the weight of the faint stirring in the hushed camp. A low clink of copper against stone, a sound swallowed instantly by the sheer size of the space around them. Stars were thinning now, sinking back into the endless black, a few bright ancient pinpricks remaining above the deepest dunes. Slow footstep crunching softly on the grit. Not a rush, not a hurry, just the necessary movement of a man preparing the journey. The caravan master. Nasir walked among the sleeping forms, his shadow long and liquid in the starlight. He did not speak. He did not need to speak. His presence was the signal. A low murmur started, low and deep like the sea. Far away, the sound of the camels beginning to shift their massive bodies, complaining slightly as the ropes tightened. The heavy load settled back onto the bone. The leather straps groaned, a necessary sound, a sound of travel etched into the very silence of the desert. The first light was not light at all, but a thinning of the darkness, a washed-out gray that promised the heat to come. The world slowly revealing its texture, the fine ripples of the sand catching the pre-dawn glow, showing patterns that had been undisturbed for 10,000 years. Moved not as individuals, but as a single slow organism, a segmented creature stretching its long body. Out across the flats, the air remained cool for these first few moments. A crystalline freshness that tasted of nothing but distance and mineral dust. A precious taste soon to be lost. The first camel rose in one long fluid motion, shaking the bells. Hanging from its thick ancient bridle, the soft copper chimes, a faint music, the only music allowed. Then the next and the next, the ripple effect of great slow power until the entire line was vertical, swaying gently, already anticipating the miles. Cloaked figures adjusted the scarves across the mouth and nose, preparing for the coming dust, the rituals of survival repeated endlessly across months of travel. The sand beneath the heavy padded feet began its rhythmic complaint, a soft, persistent whisper that became the background hum of the journey. There was no haste. There could be no haste. Speed was a folly in this land of rock and sheer emptiness. We measured time not by hours, but by the diminishing arc of the shadows, by the increasing pressure of the sun on the nape of the neck. The first hour was always the best, the air crisp, the desert floor firm from the nightly cold, the path predictable. We traveled now through a shallow valley, its sides made of low red stone hills, smooth and wind-worn like old-worn velvet. The sun finally crested the horizon, not with a sudden burst, but a slow, deliberate lift pouring out liquid amber light across the endless surface. The light caught the dust already rising, faint pale gold rising from the shuffling feet of the thousands of steps that had gone before us. Each grain of sand seemed to catch fire for a second as the sun touched it, creating a blinding shimmer, a momentary illusion of water. Shadows of the camels elongated impossibly, stretching out before us, thin black giants racing ahead, marking our slow progress. Silence deepened as the lake grew, leaving only the repetitive scrape and pad of the hooves. The creak of the saddlewood, it became a meditation, a walking prayer. Without words, the mind emptying itself of unnecessary thoughts, worries, anxieties, they simply fell away like old skin in the dryness. All that remained was the immediate truth, the breathing in, the breathing out, the heat rising the horizon, unmoving. Desert accepted this slowness, demanded this slowness. Any resistance was met with exhaustion, with despair. We walked into the heart of the morning, now the light changing from that soft amber into a hard, white intensity that pressed down on the head. Air began to thicken, to grow heavy, not humid, but loaded with the heat energy soaking into every surface, every piece of cloth, every piece of skin. Stone walls of the low hills absorbed the heat, becoming radiating furnaces pushing the warmth. Back at us, we were small figures beneath the vast sky, cloaked in rough wool, protecting us from the very heat that generated it. The world was stripped bare here, only the essentials remained. Water distance, endurance. The caravan seemed endless, stretching. Far behind me, only visible as a serpentine line of dust moving across the monochrome surface, I looked back briefly, watching the slow, steady pace of the others. The sameness of their movements, their absolute focus on the small patch of sand directly in front of their feet. This was not a race, this was a continuity, a slow passage of culture and goods across ancient routes etched deep into the geography of the world. We carried silk and spices, heavy bolts of fabric wrapped tight against the elements. Cinnabar and jade porcelain bowls stacked carefully nested against breakage. These items traveled at the pace of a single human footstep multiplied across 20 kilometers. A day, 600 kilometers a month, a staggering slow progress when viewed against the swiftness of thought or memory. But here the slowness was the power, the slowness was the certainty. The sun climbed higher, reaching its terrifying zenith. Pushing the air temperature up past tolerable levels, the ground began to shimmer. The air above the rock, distorting the view, blurring the edges of the distant hills. The hills became ghosts of hills floating in a liquid haze. Cloaked in heat, haze, unreachable, indefinable. The silence was complete now, the noise of the walking absorbed by the huge atmosphere. The very sound of the caravan seemed to have given up the effort. We drank from the leather water bags, small controlled sips savoring the lukewarm liquid, a careful rationing that defined the entire day. The mind begins to wander in the deep desert travel. It drifts, it searches for distraction. It finds none. It must settle into the simple rhythm, the sway of the camel beneath the hips, the slight city-side motion that becomes hypnotically familiar. The smell of the camel, strong and musky, mixed with the scent of dried straw and sun-baked wool, and the pervasive scent of stone. Dust. We walked past an outcrop of darker rock, a volcanic scar on the lighter sand, a reminder of the violent geology beneath this peaceful surface. Rock was obsidian black, absorbing every ray of the sun, holding the heat like an evil furnace, too hot to touch even through the thickest. Glove-hour shadows were short, now dense, black. Pools directly beneath our feet, providing no relief, no shade at all. Midday halt was still hours away, and the challenge was simply to maintain the pace, to keep the breath steady, to not look ahead too far. Focus on the path immediately ahead. Counting the number of steps between one small stone and the next day, dry bush low and gray, clinging desperately to life pushed up from the sand. A small miracle of endurance. We passed it slowly, honoring its silent, stubborn refusal to die. The heat. was an invisible, heavy blanket pressing on the shoulders, blurring the eyes, demanding sleep, demanding surrender, but surrender meant stopping, and stopping meant falling behind, meant breaking the chain, the continuity of the caravan. So we pushed on through the blinding glare, through the dust that coated the teeth and the throat, through the deep, slow heat. The world had narrowed, now shrunk to the small oval of sand. Immediately surrounding the walking feet, everything else was a distant dream. A mirage of green pastures and rushing rivers. A memory that felt impossibly far away. The reality was the hushed breathing, the slow, heavy rhythm. The ancient dust, the relentless amber sun high above the hours were measured only by the movement of the sun, which seemed to slow its pace, mockingly hovering directly overhead, refusing to move on. Stone beneath the feet was gritty and hot, sending up waves of residual heat that felt almost painful. The deep desert silence was absolute, now powerful force that seemed to push all human sound back down into the earth. The true journey was not across the land, but within the self. The slow process of stripping away the unnecessary noise until only the essential self remained. We were cloaked pilgrims. Of the route defined by the goods, we carried the slow, steady pace we kept. The slow sway continued, a deep rolling motion, like being on a very slow ocean wave, never crashing, never stopping, just moving across the vast dry floor. The only sound was the wind rising slightly, a thin sigh across the tops of the dunes, carrying nothing but more dryness. A very faint shape appeared on the horizon, hours away. A low, dark line, perhaps an escarpment, perhaps merely a trick of the heat. Haze it served as a distant goal, the next slow marker, a point to aim the collective body toward, but we did not fixate on it. We focused on the step, now the breath, now the enduring moment. Now the slow travel defined this life, defined this moment, defined the hypnotic rhythm of the Silk Road caravan journey, forever etched in the history of the slow passage of time. The sun rose, a slow amber stain, washing the horizon. The heat arrived instantly, a slow, suffocating weight settling upon the cloaked riders. The silence of the desert, unbroken save for the shifting sand and the deliberate pace of the beasts. We had left the last outpost 3 cycles of the moon past. The memory of green reeds and fresh water already dissolving into the hazy shimmer. Behind us, this middle stretch of the road was the true test, not of speed, but of endurance, a long, slow calculation, measured only by the movement of shadow. Beneath the camel train, each dawn brought the same mechanical ritual, the undoing of the hobbles. The slow groan of the standing beasts, the tightening of the rigging, the check of the water skins, a precious and finite resource, now guarded with cold precision. The chief caravanserai, called Hafez, walked the line, inspecting every knot, every bag. Every face, his movements were measured, economical, expressing no urgency, no fear, only the quiet competence required to navigate the sea of sandy. Wore thick, dark velvet robes against the glare, the fabric absorbing the harsh light, protecting his skin from the burning rays. The camels themselves, ancient vessels of burden, moved with a predictable rhythm. The sway, a low, persistent pulse that worked its way into the bones of the traveler. They averaged perhaps 25 kilometers in a good day. Slow progress when the destination lay thousands of kilometers beyond the horizon. The grid of the desert was everywhere. It coated the inside of the mouth. It settled on the eyelids. It permeated the thick woven sacks protecting the precious cargo. It was a fine red gold powder that told the story of endless grinding mountains and wind-sculpted rock carried across unimaginable distances. We were moving across a plateau of hardened gravel, a desolate expanse where life held no foothold. The ground was etched with the passage of countless previous caravans' grooves worn deep into the stone, showing the ancient, unwavering line of commerce. The silence here was immense, not merely an absence of noise, but a deep pressure against the eardrums. A hushed weight that made the sound of a simple cough seem like a detonation. The only consistent sound was the soft padding of the camel feet, the rhythmic click of their wooden packs against the metal fittings, and the occasional low grunt of the lead dromedary. That lead beast was the clock, the compass, the heart of the journey. If it slowed or faltered, the entire thousand-beast chain suffered. It grew nervous, the guards reacted instantly. It was a responsibility carried without fanfare, a slow, powerful presence ensuring the continuity of the move we were transporting more than silk now. Had taken on a sizable consignment of medicinal roots gathered high in the mountain passes, dried and bundled. They smelled faintly of earth and bitter. Spice, a sharp, clean scent, sometimes overpowering the dryness of the desert airways, were destined for the great western cities, places where gold was not currency, but rather the weight of a rare root, capable of healing an unknown ailment. Value of these small, dusty bundles outweighed the weight of the silver bullion carried in the saddlebags of the chief merchants. The light intensified toward midday, becoming a blinding white sheet, reflecting off the pale sand and salt flats Hafiz gave. The signal the cloaks were drawn, tighter faces were fully obscured, only the narrowest slit left for vision to. Look directly at the desert at noon was to risk blindness, the sun a relentless, punishing eye, overseeing the small line of humanity inching. Across the vastness we followed the tradition of the afternoon. Pause, not a full stop, but a deliberate slowing a moment to allow the beast to breathe deeply to readjust. The shifting loads, the guards dismounted only long enough to check the ropes, and to take a sip of the lukewarm, stagnant water from the heavy cured leather bags. The discipline required was extraordinary. Every movement was conserved, every drop of moisture, precious conversation, died out completely during these hours, reduced to necessary hand signals or the low guttural command to the animals. The heat blurred the horizon, generating mirages that danced and shimmered. Just out of reach sometimes, the distant shapes looked like vast cool lakes bordered by date palms, a cruel illusion that had broken the spirits of less experienced travelers. The veteran guards knew better. They kept their eyes on the immediate foreground, the rough stone. The track etched deep by time, they measured the distance not by miles, but by the number of prayers or the remaining shadow of the tallest camel in the absence of landmarks. The mind turned inward, the monotony creating a hypnotic state. The repetition, the sway, the dry air, the constant effort of breathing shallowly against the dust. It was a state akin to meditation, a prolonged emptying of thought, leaving only the immediate necessity of movement and survival. The guards who rode alongside the precious silk packages were known as the Ghost Riders. They moved silently, perpetually. Cloaked, indistinguishable from the shadows they cast, their role was simple: protect the goods at all costs and provide no opportunity for attack. The silk bales were wrapped in layers of rough canvas, then encased in hardened mud plaster, a shell against moisture and heat and prying eyes. Inside lay the treasure, the soft, shimmering bolts of gold and crimson and sapphire blue fabric destined to grace the halls of Byzantium or Rome. Each bolt carried the economic weight of a small village, the legacy of generations of careful silkworm cultivation and dyeing. The risk of carrying such concentrated wealth was immense, but so too was the reward. As the sun began its slow decline, sinking toward the west, the color of the desert changed. The brutal white gave way to soft gold, then deep amber, then the long shadows stretched out like ancient fingers pointing the way. This was the relief of the day, the brief window when the heat lessened and the desert exhaled. Depacant slightly, the camels, sensing the approach of the evening rest setting. Camp was another precise ballet of coordinated effort. The moment Hafiz raised his hand, the entire line began to dissolve into its components. Animals were unburdened, the heavy packs stacked tightly in a ring, forming a defensive wall around the sleeping area. Fires were built low and quick, using the dry scrub collected earlier in the day. The scent of dry wood smoke mingled with the stronger odor of camel sweat and the cooking spice of dried meat and boiled millet. The evening meal was simple, functional, providing the necessary fuel for the next relentless day. The chatter of the men was subdued, hushed by the sheer scale of the landscape. Surrounding them, there were tales told of previous journeys, of narrow escapes, of the generosity of distant oasis lords, of the deceptive beauty of the desert flowers that bloomed for a single night. But even these stories were delivered in a low murmur, a respectful acknowledgement of the sleeping giant around them. After the meal, the real work began. The guarding of the Ghost Riders did not eat with the main company. They took up their silent posts, immediately disappearing into the gloom. Danger was always present, though often unseen. It was not always human banditry that threatened, but the sudden shift of weather, the unexpected sandstorm, the hidden ravine, the treacherous salt marsh. But tonight the wind was low, a gentle breath across the gravel plains. The sky above us was a profound black velvet, a depth unmatched by any night sky witnessed in the cities. It was studded with a billion cold, distant lights, each star a tiny diamond etched onto the darkness, the constellations familiar. Guides to the ancient navigators moved slowly, steadily across the zenith office, taught the youngest apprentice how to identify the northern star, how to use the alignment of the three sisters to gauge the hour. Without a clock, these ancient knowledge points were more reliable than any man-made instrument in this vast, indifferent wilderness. Sleep came quickly born of exhaustion and the rocking sway of a day's journey. Men slept wrapped in thick felt blankets, the ground cool beneath them. Absorbing the day's heat, the sand was no longer a threat, but a soft cradle, a silent protector. Only sound now was the soft breathing of the resting beasts and the low, steady tread of the patrolling guards. It was a sound of vigilance, of protection, a slow, steady rhythm against the enormous silence. We were passing through an area rumored to be haunted by jinn, mischievous spirits that enjoyed leading travelers off the track. The older men ensured a small protective circle of salt was scattered around the sleeping quarters, a ritual against unseen threats, whether superstition or actual precaution. The act brought a small measure of comfort in a place where human control was so fragile. The cold of the desert night was sharp, penetrating the light wool and requiring the heavy felt. Temperature dropped drastically from the searing 100-degree heat of the afternoon to near freezing by midnight. This dramatic shift tested the materials, the supplies, and the men themselves. The water skins contracted, the wood groaned, the metals shrank. The constant flux, the intense heat. The intense cold was the true sculptor of the Silk Road traveler, refining away all softness, all excess weight. Had to be as hard and as dry as the stone underfoot days. Bled into one another, distinguished only by minor shifts in the landscape. We left the gravel plateaus and entered a region of low dunes and rolling hills of orange sand. And the going became softer, more difficult for the animals. Each step required greater effort, the sand dragging at the hooves, the packs shifting precariously. The sand whispered as the wind moved across it, a low, dry hiss, like 1,000 tiny voices recounting forgotten history. The dunes themselves were deceptive. They moved overnight, reshaping the path, swallowing markers that had stood for years. We relied heavily on Hafiz's innate knowledge, his inherited memory of the land, passed down through generations of caravan leadership. He seemed to smell the direction of the pass. He felt the change in the slope of the land, even when the eye could perceive only endless waves of sand. Scent of dust was constant, but occasionally a brief sharp smell of mineral deposits of dried sulfur or alkali would cut through the air, signifying a geological shift. We were nearing the border of a great salt marsh, a place feared for its instability. Travelers before us had lost whole caravans, sinking into the blindingly white crust that hid deep. Treacherous mud beneath. Hafiz ordered the men to double the padding on the animals' hooves, distributing their weight across a wider area. The pace slowed, becoming painstaking, careful, deliberated. Took 3 full days to traverse the edge of this treacherous land. 3 days of stark white sunlight, reflecting off the salt, blinding the eyes, requiring total focus, total silence. The silence of the salt flats was different from the silence of the gravel plains. It was a heavy, oppressive silence, a place where sound seemed to be swallowed up instantly, leaving only a ringing emptiness. The air tasted metallic, dry, and sharp. We saw the skeletal remains of past misfortune, the white bleached bones of camels caught in the sticky mire centuries ago. A stark warning. The ghost riders kept their gaze fixed outward, scanning for any movement, any irregularity. This was a place where bandits sometimes waited, knowing the caravans were at their most vulnerable, most encumbered by the terrain. But tonight we were spared. The passage was clean, though deeply demanding. As we exited the white expanse, the feeling of relief was palpable, though unspoken. The ground returned to dry, hard-packed clay etched with deep cracks from endless years of sun exposure. We rested the animals for a long evening, allowing them to graze on the sparse, tough desert grasses that miraculously sprang up here at the edge of the desolation. The fire that night burned brighter, a momentary release of tension. Hafiz allowed the water ration to be slightly increased, a rare luxury. Earned by the successful crossing, the stars seemed closer, heavier, seeming to press down on the camp, a ceiling of cold crystal. We're perhaps halfway through this immense desert leg of the journey still, weeks away from the next major center. The town of Khotan, known for its jade markets and its robust supply of fresh apricots cotton, was the beacon, the next milestone marking the transition from the desert proper back into the fringe lands of cultivation. But anticipation was a luxury few. Indulged in to look too far ahead was to invite despair or distraction. The focus remained strictly on the next step, the next hour, the next slow. Careful movement, the life of the caravan required a profound respect for the immediate present, the loading of the animals began well before the true dawn. While the air was still bitingly cold, the low thud of the packs, the creak of the leather, the smell of wet camel fur, and the faint medicinal odor of the bundled roots, the sky slowly softened from black velvet to deep indigo, then to the inevitable searing amber that promised the heat of the approaching day. Moved out as the first light touched the dunes, leaving behind the cold ashes of the fire and the faint imprints of our short rest. The road, called the ancient path, etched into the stone, demanded its payment in slow, relentless movement. We turned south, skirting a low range of reddish brown hills, their flanks heavily eroded by centuries of wind and water. The geology here was ancient stone. Deep, silent, carrying the memory of submerged seas and vanished mountains. We're traveling through time as much as through space, traversing the slow, deep history of the earth itself. The camels moved slowly, steadily. The weight of the silk and the spice and the expectation of far-off markets carried upon their stoic backs a burden shared. Patiently under the watchful eye of the desert sun, another day, another slow, steady passage into the heart of the world's great silent commerce. A world measured only by the pace of the walking beast and the endless distance yet to cover a journey of hypnotic repetition. A slow, slow move across the eternal sand. Chamber breathed a cold air, a slow exhalation of geologic time. The descent had ended, not in a vault of gold, but in a silence of stone. The light from the single lantern cast a deep amber glow across the vast circular space. Cistern dominated the room, carved from a monolithic slab of dark, unyielding material. It was perfectly smooth, its surface reflecting the ceiling like polished ice. The ancient stone drank the light, leaving long stretches of velvet. Shadow pooling deep in the corners. Around the circumference of the cistern ran a low platform of white marble. This marble was not plain, but intricately etched with lines of complex geometry, concentric. Circles flowed into spiral symbols that spoke of orbits and trajectories. They were glyphs of the high sky of constellations that had wheeled across heaven millennia ago. Stars, long since drifted or dimmed, were mapped here in cold, precise detail. The cloaked figure approached cautiously, the air thick with the dust of ages. Carried a dry, clean scent, the smell of deep earth, untouched by moisture, kneeling by the marble rim. The figure traced the lines with a gloved hand. The stone felt unnaturally cold, not just chilly, but actively drawing heat away. Then a sound began, a sound so low it felt more than heard, a subtle thrumming in the bedrock. It vibrated up through the solace of the boots, rising through the body like a slow tide. This was the chamber responding, the mechanism awakening after its immense sleep. The water in the cistern, which had been perfectly still, began to ripple. It was not agitation, but a slow, deliberate disturbance. The ripples moved outward, imperfect, concentric rings mimicking the etched patterns on the marble. The amber reflection of the lamp stretched and warped, becoming long, shimmering snakes of light. Suddenly, the etched lines on the white marble platform began to glow. A light of the deepest blue emerged, a cold, ethereal radiance. It crawled along the lines, illuminating the cosmic symbols. The geometry became three-dimensional, seeming to lift slightly above the stone surface like slow, cold lightning. Dancing across a frozen lake, the hum deepened into a resonance that felt like the pulse of the earth itself. This was clearly not a tune nor a simple reservoir. It was a timepiece, a stellar calculator, perhaps even a great astronomical clock, a chronicle etched into the very foundation of the world, a measure of epochs, not of hours. As the blue light intensified, the central stone of the cistern began to move. It rose smoothly, silently, perhaps an inch or two. The movement was glacial, yet definite, revealing a narrow, perfectly dark slit beneath its base. The shadow. There was absolute consuming. All light from that thin opening emerged, a scent foreign and startling. It was not the scent of stone or dust or decay. It was a high, clear perfume of mountain herbs, dried cedar, and perhaps winter snow. A scent of life and altitude carried into this deep subterranean silence. It suggested an outside world, immediate and clean. A stark contrast to the heavy history surrounding them. Cloaked figure hesitated, the hum of the stone reaching its zenith. The blue lines pulsed synchronously with the rising water ripples. The hand gloved in soft leather, stretched forward, reaching. For the edge of the rising cistern stone, the moment of contact brought an electric shock, not pain, but a jolt of cold, sharp energy that bypassed the skin and went straight to the minda. Vision exploded into the explorer's consciousness, brief, overwhelming it. Was an image of space, vast and silent. Not the confined space of the chamber, but wide, endless plain snow. It was falling softly, muffling all sound, a pure white expanse under a pale sky, and standing alone in that landscape was a structure utterly unique. It was not a tower or a column of conventional stone. It was a mast-tall, slender, dark, polished wood, reaching impossibly high. Its apex it carried something like a banner, but the banner was woven not of common cloth, but of fine metallic filaments shimmering. Like liquid silver, it rippled in a phantom wind that felt colder than the snow. Displayed clearly on the metallic banner was a single symbol, an open eye perfectly stylized beneath a thin, sharp crescent moon. The vision held for only a heartbeat, a frozen tableau of quiet transmission, then it snapped away, leaving behind only the echoing sensation, profound cold. The explorer blinked, regaining focus on the immediate reality. Humming mechanism, the blue light, the dry ancient air, but the symbol was now imprinted in the memory, open eye beneath a crescent moon, and there on the underside of the rising cistern stone, visible only because of the lift etched small and nearly invisible, was that exact same motif, the open eye, the crescent moon. Hum subsided, the blue light faded. The massive central stone of the cistern settled back down with a muffled thud. The slit vanished, the reflection of the amber lamp returned to its original stillness. Chamber was silent, once more hushed and watchful, but the moment of contact had changed the purpose of the place. This was not merely a ruin to be observed, it was a signal station, a point of contact left dormant across the long reaches of forgotten time. The stone had spoken, telling a tale distant. Skies and snowy plains, the cloaked figure circled the cistern, slowly the lantern. Held high, the cedar scent, however fragile, lingered close to where the stone had risen. The focus was now drawn irresistibly to that vanished seam, what was kept beneath. The monolithic weight, why the scent of mountain freshness deepened this buried chamber. What message did that solitary mast on the snowy plain transmit, and to whom the initial mission of tracking lost relics had shifted dramatically? It was now a pursuit of living signals, a search for connection. The explorer looked at the polished walls of dark obsidian, and they looked less like stone and more like the shell of a massive sleeping instrument. The smooth surfaces seemed to draw the light inward, swallowing. The illumination, the feeling of being watched, intensified it. Was the heavy scrutiny of immense age of knowledge, preserved beyond human understanding. There must be another way to access the cavity beneath the cistern. The mechanism clearly operated on astronomical principles, perhaps aligned to a specific phase of the moon or the rising of a particular star hours, passed in slow hypnotic rotation. The cloaked figure moved systematically, examining the marble platform for secondary access points. Fingers brushed against the very slight deviation in the smoothness of the marble near the edge. Single small depression, barely large enough to accept a fingertip, was not centered on the geometry, but offset near the wall. A deliberate imperfection in the flawless design testing. The pressure, the figure pushed gently into the depression. The stone groaned, a dry complaint of friction and movement. Not the deep resonance of the cistern, but the scraping of weight on weight A of the circular marble platform. Slid silently inward, revealing not another mechanism, but a simple recessed space within. That space, resting on a bed of dry moss that should not have survived, was a single item A. Box not made of wood or metal, but of a material like petrified bone. Its color was off-white, almost translucent. It was small enough to fit within 2 cup hands. The surface of the bone box was etched with minute script, too small to read clearly in the lantern light. Handling the box, the material felt warm, contradicting. The coldness of the surrounding stone it radiated a faint internal heat, a strange pulse of energy. Cloaked figure lifted the box slowly. The depression it had rested in glowed. Briefly, with that same profound blue light, the box was a key or a message. Older, perhaps the very thing the signal station was meant to protect. Holding the box felt like holding a secret waiting to unfold. Fine script on its surface seemed to wriggle in the peripheral vision that exploration had begun underground. But the true path clearly led outward and upward toward the cold plains, the solitary mast and the metallic banner with the crescent eye. The massive stone cistern sat silent and inert, a guardian whose task was completed now that the box was removed. The air, however, was beginning to change. The scent of cedar intensified, becoming sweeter, sharper. It seemed to be emanating from the small bone box itself. Soft ticking sound began emanating from inside the box, a steady rhythmic click so quiet it risked being dismissed as the sound of the explorer's own pulse, but it was external, mechanical, and relentless. What if the mechanism was not designed to keep the secret safe, but to count down the moment of its retrieval? What if the box was not a treasure, but a timer? The cold blue light faded entirely from the recess. A marble platform slid closed, sealing the evidence of the opening. The cloaked figure stood alone in the dark chamber, the lantern throwing shadows on the massive etched cistern end. In the silent darkness held the warm ticking box of petrified bone. The sound was hypnotic, relentless, promising a revelation that could not wait. The air pressed close the hushed history of the stone, now yielding to the immediate mystery of the clockwork. The next step must be outside under the actual moon to see if the sky offered any clues to the location of the snowy plains and the signaling mast. Ticking whispered promises of the journey to come. The air was hushed, still cold, a deep velvet silence. Held the desert floor before the sun dared rise. Begins in the Breithof, the pre-dawn hour where the shadow of the Dunases, sharp, blue, and deep. Fire pits glowed low embers, the last memory of night heat. Slow fading red beneath a fine layer of wind-driven grit. The men slept heavy cloaked in thick woven wool breathing, the dry air a collective sigh rising from. The hidden campa, 100 hearts beating to the rhythm of shared journey. We are still her a measured mile upon measured mile, the silk bales wrapped, tight beneath canvas and rope, the weight of the journey settled into the bone. The sound began, slowly, not sound really, but movement, shift of a camel resting its massive body. Easing against the cool, stone-like sand, a soft groan, a low rumble, deep in the throat, a waking vibration that passed through the ground. By one, the drivers stirred, lifting their heads. Heavy with sleep, the ritual of the morning was itself anching to movement etched into the culture of Passagia. History measured it in kings or battles, but in the slow step of the laden beast and the taste of dry dates at the edge of darkness. Small cough broke the silence, then the rustle of coarse linen robes. First man moved to the low fire, pushing the ash, Azadi seeking the warmth that remained. Sky was turning from black velvet to a pale wash of gray. A distant star still held its own, a diamond pinned high above the endless empty. The wire skins were checkered through a supple leather, cool to the touch. Measure of water precious counted out in sips and splashes for the animals and the mente. Camels stood Nausland jaunts, their wide feet designed for this. Relentless sinking terran waiting for the Berdenti knew must come. Light air vednet suddenly, but as a slow bleed, the eastern horizon. Catching fire, turning the vast emptiness into a sea of amber. Dunes changed, character shards shrinking. Back revealing the fine grain off the surface, the desert awakeningly, deliberately. Loading began the slow, patient work of lifting and tying. And checking the spices carefully secured saffron. And pepper, a concentrated wealth that added only whisper soft scent to the dry atmosphere. Bolts of raw silk tucked safely inside protective layers, destined for lands that had never seen this harsh, unforgiving. Sun each knot was pulled taut 1,000 hands over 1,000 years, performing the same action, the rope biting into the canvas. The driver leaning his weight into the task. His face dark, leathered beat, constant exposure eyes, narrowed against the gathering. Light he did not rushing was wasted energy in this landscape of slow endurance rushing meant mistake here. The desert claimed its due, the camel saddles settled with a dull thud. The wool thick padding mean to buffer the friction off. Motion. The bells, the deep brass bells strung around the necks of the lead. Camels began to chime softly as the animals shifted a melodic warning. A gentle, insistent rhythm that would become the soundtrack of the next 12 hours. The men finished their packing. They ate their small meal-durried bread, hard as stone dipped and weak. Tea they drank deeply of, the warmth of fleeting comfort bear the days. Heat descended. They mounted their own riding camels. The lead man took his position at the front of the long linear. Ribbon of man and beast stretching back into the fading shadow. Command was given a low, guttural sound, not sharp or demanding, but a simple instruction to move, and the journey began. The great caravan unfolded like a length of rope dragged across sand. The first steps were tentative. Camels rising with their awkward multi-stage motion lifting the world onto their backs. Then the pace settled, the measured stride of the gait that covers vast distances. With the minimum expenditure of effort, we moved east or slightly northeast. Direction was known only through the sun and the stars and the deep intuitive knowledge of the land whole direction into the memorial of the lead guide. The sand sighed beneath the weight, a continuous whispering sound, texture of dry sound. Caravan became a cloud of low, slow-moving shroud of pale. Yellow dust kicked up by those 1,000 soft feet. It settled immediate coating. Everything in a fine ochre layer, the robes, the skin, the hair, the cargo, were unified by the gust, a temporary monument of the passing of time. Around you now, the horizon is endless, clean, straight line dividing the bleached blue sky from the pale gold earth. There are no landmarks, Hereno, sheltering peaks, no sudden rivers. Only the undulation. Soft repetitive curves off the silent dunes. The sun climbed higher. The cool of the morning was rapidly forgotten, replaced by a dry, penetrating warmth that soaked into the clothing and dried the mouth. Travelers pulled the scar of Shiger across their face, covering the nose and mouth, leaving only the eyes. Expusted, producting the breath from the constant intake of grit. The light was intense, now blinding. White gold reflecting off the sand surface, making the eyes ache. The world reduced itself to the space immediately around youth, swaying hump of the camel. Heavy breathing next to youth, hypnotizing, slow lift and fall of the animal's head. You can hear the steady rhythm of the bells, now a soft, insistent clanking clank. Clank, clank, a natural metronome medicating the pace. They lull the mind, they smooth out the rough edges of thought. The repetition of the sound blends with the repetition of the motion one. Step after another, we have done this for months. This passage is not about speed. It is about survival. It is about the continuous forward motion, however slow. The distance fades. The cities behind are merely cloaked memories of noise and scent. The cities. A hetero abstract promise of comfort and commerce. There is only the present moment. Deep, quiet intensity of the moving line, the mind begins to drift as the body settles into the unchanging rhythm. Consciousness dissolves into the sun. The endless horizon, you watch the driver ahead of you. He seems to be asleep. His posture relaxes, swaying gently in the saddle. His eyes close behind the scarf, but he is not asleep. He is simply moving. He is being moved. His body knows the way, his ancient. Internal clock measures the miles. The sun reaches its zenith. The shadows disappear entirely. The heat is oppressive, silent weight pressing down on the caravan. This is the hardest time, the middle of the day one. Every thought turns to the small relief of the coming dusk, but there is no stopping, not yet. Stopping breaks the spell. Stopping invites the heat to settle. Stopping delays the destination. We press on through the midday silence. The only sound, the feet and the bells and the wind whistling thinly. Over the dunes, the goods strapped to the camel's backs feel heavier now. The silk becomes lead. The spices become stone. Effort required just to sit upright is immense. You find yourself staring at the intricate pattern etched by the wind into the side. Of the nearby dune, small ripples, perfect forms that are erased within minutes be the next puff of air. The desert teaches patience, it insists upon slowness. It demands a quiet acceptance of the vast empty scale. The days blend together. The sixth feels like the third or the first. It is the middle, the timeless center of the long, slow passage. The camels chew their kuda rhythmic, grinding sound off internal satisfaction. They are the true masters of this silent movement. They carry the weight of empires on their backs. They define the economy of the known world. You look down at your hands covered in the fine reddish dust. They look old, ancient off the journey, not separate from it. The movement is a trance walking meditation if you focus too hard on the destination. Distance becomes unbearable if you focus only on the dust. Time stops entirely. So you focus on the movement itself. Gentle city side roll. Forward swathe sound of the breath in. The hush. The air is bone dry. It extracts the moisture from the skin. The light seems trapped within the atmosphere. A golden, thick syrup coating everything to me. Our moving guy is moving, but so slowly that it feels like stillness. Cloaked procession across an unchanging stage. The wind begins to pick up slightly a subtle push against the travelers. It lifts the dust higher, no creeping shimmering curtains that blur the distant horizon. The pace remains unchanged, steady, measured, persistent. There is no excitement here, no sudden drama. This is the tedious, necessary act of bridging. The great emptiness. This is the history of trade written in the slow endurance of the desert travelers. The sun begins its slow descent. There is still horizontal true evening. The light takes on that deeper, with rich amber late afternoon. Shadows begin to reappear, stretching forward across the sand, distorting the dunes, making them seem massive. Eminento. Sight of the shadow is a relief. It marks the passage of time. It promises the eventual cooling release from the intense heat. Follow those shadows, their own elongated firms moving like spirits across the vast open floor. The clanking of the bells carries further in the cooling air. The silence between the steps is deeper, more resonant. The desert is preparing for its nightly return to velvet darkness and hushed cold. We walk into the light. We follow the ancient paths. The cargo is secure. The journey continues, one slow step after another into the deep amber glow of the sinking sun. One more hour of measured movement tone, more mile off sleep. Inducing silence. The great archway stood silent, now a vast hollow obsidian stone. Was the threshold we saw at the edge of the world's knowledge and the start of an endless quiet? Air here did not stir, it did not breathe, it was hushed beyond. Measure a velvet blanket muffling sound. We stood beneath the lintel, Alara and I, watching the last shafts of twilight fade into the chasm. Those stones were ancient and possibly old, etched not just by wind and time, but by sorrow. The basalt blocks were carved with sleeping faces, eyes closed in eternal repose, a legion of cloaked sentinels guarding a slumbering secret eye. Reached out my fingers, tracing the cold curve of a cheekbone, a perfect line of sorrow set in mineral. This place felt less like a city and more like a tomb, a vast cold jewel box containing the cessation of all things. We stepped over the line, the invisible boundary that separated the waking world from the deep sleep of the king. Instantly, the temperature dropped a sharp clean chill that sank into the marrow. The sound of our own breathing became loud, startling against the monumental. Quitel held up the lamp, its amber light struggling against the oppressive dark. The gloom swallowed the glow greedily. We walked slowly, softly through the outer passage. The ground beneath our boots was smooth slate, polished by the feet of priests and servants. Long ago above us, the vaulting roof disappeared into blackness. It was impossibly high, a celestial dome carved from the mountain heart. The scent of the air was mineral, metallic, like ancient spilled blood, and clean. Running water from subterranean springs. Alara pointed to a series of glyphs high on the wall, carved deep into the stone. They were not warring, she whispered. They are the record of the final night, the liturgy of the great sealing. The king, they believed, was not dying. He was merely shifting his consciousness to a slower plane of existence. A sleep so profound it would outlast the stars. He commanded that the city sleep with him. Every life, every flame, every whisper was to be extinguished simultaneously. They prepared the velvet shrouds, they cleaned the altars, they polished the bronze doors until they shone like mirrors reflecting nothing. We continued deeper, the passage twisting slightly downward, leading us into the earth's embrace. Walls began to reflect the light. They were not dull stone now, but sheets of something crystalline, translucent pale green like frozen seawater. It was breathtaking, this underground chamber where the light shimmered and multiplied in silent glory. It felt like walking inside a colossal geode. A mineral cathedral where light was liquid and silence was absolute. We paused by a series of niches carved into the crystal walls, each one holding an artifact of the king's court, a golden lyre, with strings turned to dust a chalice. Made of carved rock crystal, a roll of vellum sealed with an ancient stamp, and there on a low stone plinth sat the chronometer. Of absence it was not a clock, but a perfect sphere of smoky quartz, suspended within rings of dark iron. It did not tick, it did not move, it simply existed, a representation of time, halted, frozen, at the moment. The king's eyes clouded. Alara ran her hand over the cold quartz surface, a gesture of profound respect when the king slept time. Here stopped, she murmured very softly, sound like dry leaves, scattering if you stay too long inside the inner chambers. You might forget the sun exists you, might forget the need to breathe. The chamber opened into a vast rotunda, the heart of the outer defenses. In the center stood a colossal statue. A cloaked figure carved from pure gray marble. It was the queen. Standing vigil, her face was serene, terrifyingly peaceful. Her hands were clasped over a great stone sword. Her eyes were closed, but there was an intensity about her stillness that spoke of unending watchfulness. We circled the statue cautiously, the shadows lengthening and stretching like cold dark fingers across the polished floor. The floor was a mosaic depicting the celestial vault, the stars, constellations, planets, all rendered in perfect detail using amber and lapis lazuli stone. It was a map of the heavens. On the night the great sleep began, I felt a dizzying sense of disorientation. The weight of history pressing down, making the air thick and hard to draw, moved towards the eastern archway, the one leading deeper into the citadel, towards the king's final resting place. Archway was different, guarded not by sleeping faces, but by silent, cold darkness as we approached. I heard it for the first time, a sound that defied the silence, a sound that shouldn't exist. It was whisper, slow and deep and resonant, yet seeming to come from nowhere. It was not a human voice. It was the sound of air moving over ancient metal, slowly, sadly, rhythmic, stopped frozen, her lamp shaking slightly. The amber light danced nervously on the queen's marble feet. She raised a hand, signaling absolute stillness, absolute quiet. The whispering grew slightly louder. It sounded like a heavy chain dragging across a smooth floor, or perhaps the turning of a massive unseen gearet seemed to emanate. From the very stone itself, a low grinding hum of immense power. This is the breath of the wards, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The mechanisms that maintain the stasis, the defenses that keep the waking world out, we have disturbed this stillness. And the city breathed slowly to warn us. We crept closer to the archway, pressing ourselves against the cool velvet stone of the wall. Through the archway I could see only blackness and inky void that seemed deeper and more absolute than the natural. Dark, but within that void there was a faint, persistent glimmer, a single solitary point of light, floating impossibly far away. It was not the reflection of our lamp. It was self-contained, cold, luminous green. It pulsed once gently, twice slowly, a beacon. In the abyssal dark, the whispering stopped abruptly, the silence snapping back into place, sharper, harder than before. Alara stepped forward, tentatively peering into the blackness of the inner passage. The air here is different, she murmured. The gravity shifts, the laws of things become mutable. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a single silver chime, a small object of finely wrought metal. She held it up, letting the last vestiges of the amber light catch its surface. If we move forward now, we move into the king's deep dream state, she said softly. It is the heart of the citadel, where the sleep is not silence, but infinite movement. Suspended, we must be careful not to wake anything that desires its eternal rest. She took a deep breath, gathered her strength, and took the first step into the green-lit void. The moment her boot touched the dark floor, the green light expanded slightly, becoming a faint mist, a luminous vapor filling the passage. And then the chime in her hand rang once, a clear, pure note cutting through the monumental quiet. But Alara had not moved her hand. The chime had rung itself. We looked at each other, the understanding sinking slowly between. Used like deep, heavy water, the city was responding to her presence, reacting. To the metal, the silver, the ancient connection, the chime rang insistent faster, this time a triple pulsing note. And then from the deep dark where the green mist swirled came a response. A heavy, slow, rhythmic echoing beat like a colossal heart thrumming. Deep within the mountain's core was the pulse of the king's sleep, the steady measure of his consciousness suspended in mineral time. Green mist coalesced, thickening, swirling, forming vague shapes at the edge of my vision. Were they the cloaked figures of the court finally waking, or merely shadows playing tricks in the mutable light? The rhythmic beat intensified, faster, stronger, pulling at the very foundations of the earth alara. Lifted the chime, holding it out into the swirling green mist. A gesture of offering, or perhaps challenge. The silence had completely dissolved, replaced by the steady, hypnotic drumming. We're standing on the precipice between history and eternity, between solid stone and the fluid reality of a king's slumber. Green light pulsed, drawing us deeper, pulling us forward into the endless beat. We must follow the sound. Alara whispered, her eyes wide fixed on the shimmering green mist. We must know what keeps the heart beating in this city of eternal sweat. Ancient power maintains this hushed monument. I felt the pull to an undeniable compulsion to step into that luminous darkness to find the source of that heavy, magnificent rhythm. The beat was growing, louder, closer, surrounding us, enveloping us. Powerful drone that vibrated in bones. It felt like moving through water, slow and thick and velvet soft. The path ahead was obscured only by the relentless green glow and the mesmerizing pulse that promised secrets untold and sleep unending. Final chime rang out, then a high, brittle note that seemed to crack the silence of the ages. And the beat answered, drawing us forward into the mist, towards the sound, towards the deep mystery of the king's eternally throbbing heart. The sand had been fine that morning, finer than powdered jasper, almost invisible, yet it clung still to the rough weave of the traveler's cloak, clinging to the edges of the hood and settling deeply into the creases of the leather. Waterbags, the desert air remained. Thin and dry, a vast hushed vacuum, absorbing sound and memory alike. The rhythm began immediately, a slow, inescapable cadence. The gentle swaying of the camel's spine beneath the rider, the low, almost inaudible grind of their massive teeth processing. The dry thistle offered hours before the desert floor was mostly stone, now flat, wide slabs of worn ancient rock, etched with patterns of wind, not human. History, just the ceaseless, relentless carving of the elements. These stones reflected the late afternoon light, not harshly, but with a deep amber warmth that seemed to stain the horizon itself. It was the 7th week since leaving the last reliable citadel, the one with the high stone walls and the promise of civilization yet to come. Weeks merged into weeks separated only by the subtle shifts in the moon's phase and the decreasing sweetness of the dried figs. There were no mountains here, only plains infinite and relentless, stretching out under a sky so vast it felt like a heavy blue velvet dome pressing down on the small thread of the caravan moving beneath. This of the journey was known to the guides as the Forgotten Valley, a place where water sources were rumors and time ceased to possess any real meaning. You measured progress not by leagues or hours, but by the number of times you had watched the twin shadows of your camel shorten, then lengthen, then vanish completely as the sun passed its highest point and descended towards the west. The movement was everything now. A hypnotic forward motion, a mechanical insistence of purpose. The lead camel, a great hulking beast named Kamar, paced slow and steady its large, padded feet disturbing the dust in precisely the same way every time a soft expulsion of fine tan powder, followed by a gentle suction sound as the foot lifted. 1, 2, 3, 4. The count became the internal metronome of the mind. 1, 2, 3, 4. The rocking of the saddle, a cradle for the tired spirit. 1, 2, 3, 4. The repetition a comfort, a kind of philosophical surrender to the endless road. The history being made here was not one of great battles or famous declarations. It was the dull history of commerce, the history of persistence, the history of simply moving massive bundles of silk and spice from one place where they were valued to another where they were valued more. The cargo was cloaked meticulously, protected from the sun and the dust. The rich colors of the dyes, the deep reds, the royal blues, the brilliant yellows. of the newly processed fabrics remained hidden beneath layers of coarse canvas. They traveled unseen, precious secrets bundled against the relentless indifference of the wasteland. Sometimes the wind picked up a dry whisper, a breath from the distant mountains, bringing with it the ghosts of smells past. Maybe the scent of pine, maybe the faint trace of salt from a forgotten sea. It stirred the loose sand into tiny swirling eddies, miniature dust devils, dancing briefly before collapsing back into the monotony of the plain. The sun was now noticeably lower, a massive disk of burning amber, suspended just above the horizon, creating shadows that stretched out impossibly long, thin fingers pointing directly eastward. They were racing the shadows, always trying to keep ahead of the true night, the profound cold that followed the sun's disappearance. Sleep storytelling is concerned not with action, but with the slow, steady erosion of time, and this of the Silk Road was nothing if not the purest distillation of time's passage. The man beside the narrator, the young apprentice named Kavi, shifted in his seat, his body accustomed now to the discomfort, the muscle memory of the ride taking over. His eyes, however, still betrayed a certain longing for detail, a desire to name every dune, every piece of quartz, every distant haze, yet even he was slowing down his observations, becoming less urgent, less necessary. No longer asked how much farther, but simply watched the back of the guides. Broad shoulders silhouetted against the deepening sky, the guide, a man called Abbas, was stone itself, silent, reliable, immovable. He had traveled this route perhaps 100 times, perhaps 1,000. The path was etched into his memory not as coordinates on a map, but as a series of specific sensations: the smell of the air when the water was close, the subtle shift in the temperature that signaled a change in the prevailing wind, the feel of a specific grade of sand beneath the camel's hoof. Abbas was cloaked entirely, his face obscured by protective wraps. Only his dark, intense eyes were visible, focused solely on the track. Ahead, the ancient track trodden by untold generations of merchants, pilgrims, and soldiers, a history so deep it was buried beneath the dust edges. It felt like they were traversing a canvas of singular color, a muted ochre that bled into the pale, dusty blue of the sky. This monotony was the true sedative of the desert, the lack of variation, forcing the mind to cease its anxious scanning and settle instead into the deep, quiet churn of the body. Movement continued, relentless, slow, ponderous. A slow historical documentary unfolds like this, frame by frame, a study in persistence, a testament not to human genius but to human endurance. The heavy leather harness creaked, a familiar sound, a counterpoint to the soft snorting of the camels and the occasional lowing noise they made, a deep guttural complaint about the weight or the heat, or perhaps just the sheer endlessness of their servitude. Study the history of this road, not for the speed of the travel, which was negligible, but for the sheer sustained effort over years and decades. A bale of raw silk might take 3 years to move from the mulberry farms of the east to the markets of the west. A slow migration of material value. Imagine that the life of the merchant was defined by these cycles of movement, long months of nothing but sun, sand, and the slow development of callus on the inner thighs. The caravan became their temporary world, their moving city. The familiar faces, the shared water cup, the nightly ritual of building their protective circle of supplies and animals to ward off the encroaching night cold and the unseen dangers. Tonight, the halt would come just before the last light was gone. Abbas signaled to stop with a single downward sweep of his hand. The camels immediately obeyed, dropping to their knees. With a rough grinding sound, the sound of heavy cargo meeting the earth, the dust rose one last time in a cloud of amber light, catching the final rays of the sun before settling into the cold stone floor. The immediate silence that followed this cessation of movement was profound, almost shocking. It was a vacuum of sound, a moment of true desert quiet. The air cooled instantly, the dryness pulling the heat away from the body almost aggressively. The routine of the evening began, slow and measured, untying the heavy loads, securing the valuable goods, checking the camels for saddle sores and exhaustion. The water rations were distributed, strictly measured drops of life, saved carefully from the last oasis 3 days ago. The fire was small intentionally, so built from scarce dry brush gathered throughout the day. It cast a warm, hushed glow, not illuminating the darkness, but simply pushing it back a few feet, creating a small circle of humanity. Against the colossal indifference of the desert night, the ancient stones surrounding the fire pit began to radiate the day's stored heat, offering a brief warmth before the true chill set in Kabi stirred the meager stew, a thick mix of lentils and dried meat. The smell momentarily dominating the sterile air. They spoke little words were too precious, too tiring, the silence more nourishing than conversation above. Then the sky deepened from dusty blue to the infinite black of space. The first stars appeared tentative pinpricks, then thousands more. Rushing into view, a velvet curtain pierced by diamond light. The sheer number of stars visible in the desert overwhelmed the senses, reminding the traveler of their infinitesimal size. This was the history lesson, the most important one, the silence. Of the night, the slow turning of the constellations, the path they followed, was guided by these same fixed lights that had guided caravans 3,000 years before. The continuity was absolute, terrifyingly beautiful. The ancient stars watched. The X-path, the cloaked figures moved beneath them. The amber light of the distant campfire flickered one day closer to their destination. One day further from their starting point, the slow unwinding of the day into night was a meditation. The slow chewing of the camels, their heavy breathing, the quiet rustle of the coarse blankets being spread out on the sandabas. Sat cross-legged near the fire, his eyes still alert even as his body rested. He pulled a small stone tablet from inside his tunic, worn smooth by years of handling a record-keeper's tool. He used a piece of charcoal to etch a small line onto the surface, marking the distance covered and the rations. Consumed a quiet, boring record of survival. This was the business of the road, the meticulous accounting, the slow realization that time was their most expensive commodity, consumed mile by mile. Breath by breath, the air grew crisp, sharp, almost painful. The temperature differential between the late afternoon and the current moment was immense, a sudden violent shift. The travelers pulled their woolen wraps tighter, drawing the rough fabric close around their faces, leaving only the smallest gap for breathing. The desert at night is completely cloaked, a world defined by shadows and subtle noises, the distant howl of a jackal, the soft whisper of the wind moving over the massive dunes far away, a sound like brushed velvet. The deep stillness settled over the camp, a profound quiet broken only by the crackle of the shrinking fire. The sleep they sought was heavy, necessary. Immediate, a total surrender to exhaustion. The dream would be the rocking motion of the camel, the relentless repetition of the track, a continuation of the slow journey, even in unconsciousness. Historian watching the scene from the perspective of centuries later sees not excitement but a profound peace born of necessity. The peace of the endless road, the quiet understanding that the goal exists only if the next step is taken, and the breathing around the fire slowed, deepened, synchronized. The camel's massive bulk provided a silent living wall, a shield against the night. The fire dwindled, leaving behind only a hushed glow of hot coals, red amber against the gray sand. The vastness of the ancient Silk Road swallowed the small camp whole, protecting it and forgetting it simultaneously. It was a moment suspended in time, a continuous history of slow, steady movement under the indifferent eye of the stretched heavens. The earth turned relentlessly, carrying them toward the morning light and inevitable resumption of the journey toward the next mountain pass, the next ancient stone fortress, the next precious commodity awaiting shipment onward and forever. Inward toward the heart of the world's great silent commerce. Let the slow passage of this desert night become the steady rhythm of your own rest. The heavy silence, the deep hush shadows, the slow turning of the stars, a quiet, steady progression. Into the depths of sleep, a velvet blanket drawn across the tired mind. The scent of dust, the smell of cold stone. The distant movement of sand, the endless flow of time itself, slow, constant, inescapable. Carrying you gently forward, the cool black velvet of the pre-dawn air still clung tightly to the shoulders of the great desert, to sand. A cold ash under the broad, soft pads of the camels, moving with that slow, unstoppable rhythmic sway that defined this entire civilization of motion, Elohim. A gentle friction against the massive silence of the Gobi or the Taklamakan. It did not matter which desert held them now, for they were simply held by the desert itself, held captive by its endless expanse and its profound hushed breath, the lead. Camel, known simply as Elder, paced his steps meticulously, never breaking the pace established over weeks and months of walking the burden strapped tight and balanced perfectly across his twin humps, heavy bolts of tightly woven yellow silk from the looms of Khotan resting beneath thick protective layers of oiled leather and coarse dyed wool, all secured with ropes of twisted yak hair ropes that smelled faintly of animal sweat and salt, and the dry mineral tang of the dust itself. The chief caravan master walked alongside Elder, his face shielded by a simple piece of white linen wrapped carefully around his lower face, leaving only his eyes. Visible eyes narrowed slightly, watching the faint, almost imperceptible change in the eastern sky, where the dark indigo of night was starting to bruise into a pale gray, suggesting the inevitable return of the amber sun. Fate had been moving since before the midnight cold, seeking to cover the maximum distance before the heat hammered down upon them at midday, when every shadow shrinks and the air thickens into a shimmering liquid illusion that warps the horizon and steals the breath away. Only consistent sounds were the soft, wet snuffling of the camels' breathing. Through their specialized desert noses, the whisper of their enormous feet, displacing the fine silica dust, and the relentless subtle creak of the wooden frames and the leather straps, protesting against the constant shifting weight of the precious cargo they carried eastward or westward. It barely mattered, for the direction was only relative to the next oasis, the next point on the ancient etched map of human trade and desire. Each man in the caravan, a handful of silent, determined figures, cloaked heavily against the lingering chill, moved in their own slow, meditative rhythm, a walking meditation enforced by necessity and the sheer boring enormity of the distance they must conquer step by painstaking step. The cloaks they wore were thick and heavy, woven from the dark fibers of mountain goat hair, providing insulation against both the frozen night and the scorching day, a simple practical duality that had sustained travelers on this route for countless centuries, since the time of the great empires whose names are now only sandblasted carvings on derelict stone. The silence was occasionally broken by the soft clatter of a tiny piece of basalt stone kicked loose by a camel's foot, or the faint, muffled chewing of one of the younger guides gnawing on a piece of preserved dried apricot salvaged from a small leather pouch tied tight around his waist, a momentary sweet interruption in the pervasive taste of dust and dry stale air. The sky brightened slowly, not with the haste of a mountain sunrise, but with the languid reluctance of a vast desert reluctant to let go of its cool embrace. The edges of the dunes ahead now began to define themselves in sharp relief against the brightening eastern curve, revealing the endless sculpted geometry of the sand-sea ridges and troughs, shaped by winds that might have blown 1,000 years ago or only yesterday, the work of time, measured in the granularity of quartz crystals. Yusuf adjusted the small copper medallion hanging beneath his woolen tunic, a gesture of comfort and habit the metal cool against his chest despite the rising light, he thought. Not of the wealth they carried, though the fortune stacked high on the backs of these great beasts were staggering. He thought only of the next hour, of the next kilometer of water consumption, and the integrity of the ropes maintaining. The ropes was a constant obsession, a silent prayer to consistency, for a broken binding meant shifting. Load meant chafing, meant injury to the camel, meant delay, meant exposure, meant death in this environment, where time and patience were the only currency that truly mattered. He observed the fourth camelback carrying 2 large clay amphorae filled with olive oil from the Mediterranean shores, oil sealed carefully with pitch and wax. Heavy, slippery, dangerous cargo, whose value only increased the further they moved from the coast. He watched the movement of the amphorae, making sure the padding beneath the camel's load saddle was still robust and thick, ensuring no pressure points developed against the animal's hide. The sun finally crested the horizon, not a fiery orb, but a magnificent amber smear, a slow bleed of gold across the pale blue-gray sky, and suddenly the world shifted, the sand turning instantly from dull ash to a blinding, brilliant ochre, reflecting the light back upwards, scorching the lower air. This was the signal, the true start of the day, and soon the protective cold would be entirely burned away, replaced by the dry, searing heat that would force them to move even slower, more deliberately, conserving energy and minimizing sweat. The precious water held tightly within their bodies, the most valuable commodity. Of all the long shadows of the camels stretched out before them, immensely elongated, monstrous, distorted shapes, racing ahead across the dune shadows that moved faster than the animals, casting them a silent race against the coming midday when the sun would be directly overhead and those shadows would shrink to mere puddles beneath the animals' bellies, offering no relief, no depth, no dimension to the landscape. They passed a feature now a massive jumble of ancient stone, weathered almost unrecognizable as anything man-made, yet clearly placed with intention centuries ago. A ruined caravanserai, perhaps, or merely an old watchtower, marking a long-forgotten boundary of a lost kingdom. The stone was granite dark and smooth where the wind had worked it tirelessly, etched deep with linear markings, not written language, but perhaps tallies or ancient markers of distance, faded inscriptions that defied easy interpretation, ghosts of travelers. Long dust resting beneath the shifting dunes. Yusuf remembered passing this spot many times. The structure always seemed to melt a little more into the ground each time. He saw a slow, inexorable surrender of human architecture to geological persistence, the ultimate quiet victory of the desert. He felt the dryness in his throat, a deep ingrained dryness. That water rarely fully extinguished, only momentarily appeased it. Was the dryness of the air, the dry static electricity that seemed to strip moisture from everything living and non-living? Alike he signaled with a slow lift of his hand, a minimal movement requiring minimal energy for a brief rest stop, no longer than a time. It took to chew a small handful of dried figs and let the camels take a single measured sip of the carefully rationed water. The caravan stopped instantly, the motion ceasing with an almost unnatural suddenness. The noise of walking replaced by a profound deep stillness, broken only by the settling of the ropes and the deep rumbling sigh of the lead camel, settling its weight onto its knees, a long drawn-out sound of relief and profound animal patience. The men dismounted slowly, their joints stiff after hours of relentless movement, their bodies accustomed to the sway, but momentarily protesting the cessation of that motion. They moved like mechanical figures whose spring had just unwound. Water was drawn from the heavy leather skins stored deep within the cargo, protected from the direct heat of the sun. The water tasted flat and warm and vaguely of leather, but it was life. It was the binding agent of the entire journey. Each man took precisely 3 mouthfuls, counting them out slowly, savoring the texture and the fleeting coolness against the back of the throat. Yusuf did the same, his movements deliberate, his focus on efficiency and conservation. He watched the camels drink a tiny amount, carefully given in small wooden bowls, held close to the animals' lips, watching their large liquid amber eyes for any sign of distress or dehydration. The camels were the engine of this venture. They were treated with a reverence bordering on worship, for without them the journey was impossible, the riches worthless. One of the younger camels, named Lapis, was showing a slight hesitancy in its step. Yusuf knelt, checking the thick protective sandals woven from tough cord and leather, wrapped around the young camel's feet, ensuring no sharp stone had worked its way beneath the padding, ensuring the precious, delicate footpads were protected. From the burning ground, he gently rubbed the camel's nose, a gesture of quiet assurance. The animal responded with a deep, resonant purr, a sound that carried the deep vibration of its massive chest, a sound unique to the resting camel. A sound of profound comfort in the midst of discomfort. The sun was now climbing fast, burning off the last remnants of the cool morning air. The shadows were retreating closer to the objects that cast them, the sand starting to feel hot, even through the thick leather soles of their boots. They rested for barely 20 minutes, the mandated and immutable period of respite. The time exactly calculated to refresh the body and allow the camels a brief rest of muscle and joint without allowing them to fully settle, which would make the effort of rising too strenuous. Yusuf gave the signal for resumption of travel, a soft low whistle that barely carried beyond the immediate vicinity of the caravan, the sound, a thread of human intention woven into the vast expanse of the desert emptiness. The camels rose slowly, methodically, levering themselves up, first on their back legs, then their front legs, the load shifting momentarily, then settling back into its familiar balance, and the procession began. Eastward toward the distant promise of the stone cleft, a hidden spring known only to those who traveled this specific unforgiving track. The pace now was even slower than the dawn pace, a deliberate conservation of energy against the rising heat. The sun already felt like a physical weight pressing down on their heads and shoulders, forcing them to stoop slightly, though they fought the urge to bend beneath its invisible pressure. They walked into a shimmering illusion, now the air above the sand vibrating with heat, creating false lakes and distant velvet cities that were merely reflections of the sky and the ground. Transposed by the physics of the heat haze, these illusions were constant companions, requiring the eye to constantly refocus to discern the real from the spectral, to trust only the ground directly beneath the feet. Landscape was opening up from rolling dunes into a flatter, harder plain, where the sand was packed down, firm, mixed with small gray pebbles and shards of ancient volcanic stone, evidence of a deeper underlying geology buried beneath the soft dunes in other places here. The walking was easier, the footing more reliable, but the heat was more intense, reflecting directly off the hard ground into their faces, and they missed the slight protection offered by the softer, cooler sand of the morning. Yusuf reached into a small internal pocket of his coat, retrieving a small piece of dried meat spiced heavily with preserved ginger and salt. A quick, potent jolt of energy and flavor against the monotony of the journey. The spice momentarily cut through the dryness and was a welcome sensory shock. He thought briefly of the immense journey ahead, the vast distances that still separated them from the fertile valleys and the bustling markets where the silk would finally be unpacked, admired, sold for incredible profits that fueled empires and built the very roads they walked upon. He looked back at the caravan stretching behind him, 22 camels in total, each carrying a king's ransom of goods. Spices, jade, glass, rubies, all hidden beneath the dull brown and gray protective wrappings, looking for all the world, like merely heavy sacks of feed to the untrained. I, the fifth camel, carried heavy bolts of blue velvet cloth, dyed with expensive indigo, a deep lustrous blue that absorbed the light. Even through its thick wrappings, a color that symbolized depth and power, the velvet, a material of quiet luxury, destined for the courts of Samarkand, or perhaps even further west to Byzantium. The sheer volume of wealth represented by this slow, deliberate line of animals was staggering, yet their movements were entirely mundane, entirely focused on the simplest tasks of survival: breath, step, water, rest, repeat. They passed the carcass of a long-dead desert beast, a wild ass perhaps, or an unfortunate ibex, bleached white bones scattered across the hard ground, a silent, stark reminder of the deserts. Bleached white bones scattered across the hard ground, a silent, stark reminder of the desert's zero tolerance for weakness or mistake. The cycle of life and dust played out in the glaring sun. The midday heat approached its zenith, now the sun directly overhead, casting no shadow to speak of, the world reduced to shades of blinding gold and dusty brown. The air utterly still, only the sound of breathing and the soft, slow fall of the camel pads. Men now walked with their heads bowed, relying on instinct and the absolute fidelity of the camel track, worn shallowly into the hard earth over millennia of similar journeys. A track that served as an ancient etched guideline in a landscape that otherwise offered no landmarks. The dust raised by the caravan was minimal now because of the packed ground, but the air was still thick with fine particulates that coated the tongue and throat, leaving a gritty residue that felt impossible to completely clear. They reached a point where the plain narrowed, a gentle constriction formed by low hills of shale and reddish stone, the stone etched with millennia of erosion, forming sharp, serrated ridges that looked like the teeth of some giant sleeping beast. This narrowing was a transition point, a shift away from the pure desert floor toward the foothills of the high mountains that guarded the next major leg of their route. The landscape was changing, offering visual relief, but introducing new dangers: steep, uneven ground, and the potential for flash floods during the infrequent sudden cloudbursts. The stone was cool to the touch despite the intense sun, where it was sheltered beneath small overhangs. They sought the minimal shadow offered by the low ridges, walking single file now, the camels moving with careful sidesteps around the larger outcroppings of reddish rock. Yusuf spotted a small scatter of bright green moss clinging tenaciously to the sheltered side of a rock face, a sign of underground moisture, a small reassurance that the stone cleft spring was indeed ahead, exactly where it should be according to the old maps and the accumulated wisdom of his ancestors who had made this journey hundreds of times before him. They did not stop here. They acknowledged the change in the geology, the small silent promise of approaching water, and continued their slow measured advance. The rhythm never breaking the pace determined by the slowest and strongest camel in the line. The afternoon wore on, a long drawn-out process of resistance against exhaustion. The energy conserved in the morning now being carefully spent the bodies of the men, moving on muscle memory fueled by sheer discipline. The light began its subtle, slow descent away from the harsh white brilliance of midday, returning toward the softer golden hue of late afternoon. The shadows beginning their slow, majestic return, lengthening, gradually stretching out from the east, anticipating the coming evening. The air, though still hot, began to lose its intense, biting edge, the quality of the light softening, bathing the reddish hills in a deep amber glow, painting the ancient stone with warmth and depth, making the etched lines of time stand out sharply. They were now walking through a canyon-like formation, the walls rising about 50 feet on either side, cloaking them somewhat from the worst of the setting sun's direct glare. This passage felt hushed and protective after the raw exposure of the open plain. The only sound that seemed to matter here was the constant, low resonant sound of the wind moving high above the canyon rim, a sound like a distant sea, or the sighing of ghosts, a deep, powerful sonic velvet that wrapped around a small caravan they followed. The dry riverbed that wound through the canyon, a path of smooth, rounded stones and sand polished by water that had not flowed here for months or years, but whose power during its rare visitation was evidenced by the massive, smooth boulders tumbled into the passage. Yusuf knew that the stone cleft was just beyond the end of this canyon, where the dry wash opened out into a small basin sheltered by a semicircle of taller rock formations, providing natural defense and concealment. A perfect place for a night encampment. He felt the fatigue deep in his legs, but the anticipation of the stop, the promise of deep rest and fresh, clean water gave him renewed strength, a final reservoir of will to push through the last kilometer. He inhaled deeply, the air here smelling faintly of minerals and dry thyme growing somewhere. High on the rocky slopes, a welcome, subtle scent distinct from the dry smell of dust and camel hair. The camels responded to the change in the ground, the smell of the damp earth beneath the dry surface layers, the scent of water, even a faint, powerful magnetic pull that guided their massive bodies toward the goal. They walked with a slightly renewed vigor, a subtle increase in the speed of their massive, slow strides. The sun touched the canyon rim, casting long, dramatic shadows across the canyon floor, turning the rocks into shifting, geometric shapes. The light was now pure molten gold, incandescent and heavy. They emerged from the narrow passage into the sheltered basin. The stone cleft revealed before them a massive, broken slab of dark, igneous rock resting against the canyon wall, and beneath it a small pool of crystal clear water fed by a slow, steady seep from deep within the rock. A truly ancient spring, sacred and indispensable. The relief was physical, palpable. The men stopped instantly, their exhaustion forgotten, replaced by the silent, focused urgency of setting camp, securing the perimeter, and allowing the precious animals to drink. Yusuf allowed the camels 3 full minutes of drinking, measured precisely to prevent overconsumption and subsequent bloat after the long day of travel. Watching the long necks reach down to the cool, dark water, the sound of their deep, steady drinking a symphony of survival. He watched the light fade, the last lingering ember dissolving into the soft gray of twilight, the stars already beginning to prick the darkening sky one by one. The same immense silent stars that had guided travelers here for thousands of years, watching over the slow, relentless movement of goods and ideas across the vast, silent heart of the world. The journey paused, but the work of survival continued. The unloading of the fragile cargo, the spreading of the thick wool blankets, the building of the small fire whose smoke would rise thin and straight into the cold upper air. Yusuf knelt beside the fire, watching the small flames catch the dry twigs, the sound of the crackling fire, a comfort, a fragile sign of human domain in the enormous silent landscape, listening to the slow measured chewing of the camels, now finally settled for the long desert. Night cloaked by the stillness, the ancient journey waiting only for the dawn to move. The cool air breathed a silence heavier than stonite pressed against the ears, a hushed velvet curtain draped across the centuries. Since anyone had stood, here Elias lifted the simple oil lamp, its amber. Light struggled against the infinite blackness of the hidden vault as was not. A tomb, this was something old Dara sanctuary built for forgetting or perhaps for waiting. Floor beneath his worn boots was polished. Basalt smooth and cold, reflecting the weak light and long slow watery ripples that seemed to bend time itself new. He was deeper now than he had ever intended. The world outside, the shifting sands, the burning sun. He felt like a legend told by a grandparent, not real life. Not now. The walls were etched with symbols that defied quick understanding. They were not glyphs of warning or praise. They were patterns, geometric rivers flowing into square circles, intersecting lines that vanished into the darkness above each mark, suggested immense effort each. Line carved by hands that understood the profound weight of permanence. The sheer defiance of rock against time touched the nearest shoulders. Stone felt dry, unbelievably dry, brittle, almost as if all moisture, all life had been painstakingly wicked away thousands of years ago. To preserve this sacred stillness that now felt almost alive, breathing shallowly, waiting for the disruption of his presence here sound, he thought. He heard it was nothing like a footfall, nothing like falling. Sand, it was a sliding, whisperous shift in the pressure of the air just behind. Him, Elias turned slowly, lamp held high, amber beam danced across the shadows, reveling. Only more wall, more etched stone, more ancient. Quieted was the echo of his own breathing, perhaps magnified by the vastness of the subterranean space here, perhaps. It was the memory of the cloaked, once-hosed, silent keepers whose stories he had only found in tid scroll scraps high above in the Houthi, were the guardians of the threshold, silent mourners of the past they had built this not for themselves, but for the memory they protected. Moved forward slowly, counting his steps, not because he feared getting lost, but because the counting offered a small ancora connection to the mundane rhythm of the living. Whirled in 2, 3, 4, the rhythm was. Slow, the space widened into a great hall. Ceiling was impossibly high, lost in the shadows, a cathedral built not for prayer, but for preservation. In the center of the hall stood a single structure. It was a pedestal of dark iron, not stone. It looked starkly modern against the backdrop of the deep, ancient rock, but the iron was oxidized, the surface rough and pitted, probing. Its age was measured not in centuries, but in millennia. Upon this pedestal rested the objective. Was not the jewel, the map, or the weapon he had half expected. It was a sphere of opaque glass, or perhaps frozen ice the size of a man's head. It emitted no light, it simply absorbed it, becoming a void of pure blackness. In the center of the amber illumination, Elias approached with caution. The air around the sphere was noticeably colder than the rest of the tomb. It felt like touching a winter memoria, forgotten moment of absolute zero. Circled the pedestal, his shadow long and stretching, like a distorted giant across the stone floor, saw that the iron was not merely a stand, it was etched with minute script, unlike the wall carvings. This script was human-readable, though archaic language of the First Kingdom began to trace. The letters with his fingers, metal was shocking cold, even through his leather glove. The script spoke of observation, not ownership. It described the sphere as the eye of the unseen, a reservoir of silence. A counterweight to cause it was the record. Keeper of things that should never have happened, at history's scrubbed clean by time and war, were held captive within this cool glass. Kajeli purpose of the cloaked ones became suddenly clear. They were not guarding a treasure, they were guarding a truth that, if released, would unravel the very fabric of accepted history. This place was a library of ghosts, a vault of denial. Elias felt a profound sadness, a crushing empathy for the burden carried by those ancient guardians, their whole civilization, dedicated to the maintenance of this one silent sphere and its terrifying cargo of fact. Placed the lamp down beside the pedestal, its light reflecting dimly off the base of the sphere. For the first time he risked reaching out. His hand hovered above the surface, hesitating, wondered what would happen if he touched it. Would the silence spill out? Would the lost histories flood his mind? Will he be overwhelmed by the sorrow of 1,000 forgotten kings, 1,000 unremembered battles, 1,000 A raised Namesh drew his hand back, resisting the hypnotic pulse. Sphere was an invitation to madness, a door to too much truth, and he knew deep down that history, when served raw, was deadly instead. He focused on the architecture of the halter must be an exit. Another way through structure was too complex, too purposeful to have only one path leading into this final silent room. Moved along the perimeter of the house searching for a seam, a subtle deviation in the polished basalty stone. Remained solid Relinals until his foot nudged something slighter. Difference in height, a change in pitch, knelt down, brushing away the dust. It was a faint line. Almost invisible and perpendicular to the wall, a fault in a disguised opening. Pushed against the wall gently at first and with greater force, the stone resisted it, was heavy, massive, impenetrable. Look back at the sphere absorbing the ambient light at the iron pedestal, the only element not of this stone. The script had spoken of balance of counterweight. Elias realized the sphere was not merely guarded by the structure, it was integral to its function. He returned to the pedestal and examined the iron base. There was a small depression, perfectly sized. Lamp perhaps, or something like either source of light or heat, or maybe a key. Took the cold heavy sphere of glass. It weighed more than it looked like concentrated lead, lifted it carefully the moment it left the pedestal. The great hall reacted not with a crash or a tremor, but with a deep resonant groan that shook the air, a sound that seemed to come from the deepest roots of the mountain. Etched patterns on the walls suddenly shimmered. They did not glow, but pulsed with a brief internal shadow wand. The of the wall he had found, with the faint seam it slid inward, soundless leveling a passage beyond Delius, stood holding the sphere, the void in his hands. The iron pedestal, now empty, was silent. Looked at a dark tunnel ahead. It was narrower than the main hall's cramped and low. It felt less formal, less ceremonial. Placed the sphere carefully on the cold stone floor. Could not carry that burden and navigate the unknown path. Needed his hands free. He needed light retrieving his lamp. He stepped into the newly opened passage. The air here was different. It smelled of ozone and wet earth, a smell that suggested depth and the presence of water, or perhaps something that had lived here. One seethed passage immediately curved downward steeply. Used his hands against the rough-hewn stone for balance. This path was clearly an emergency route of a service bethoused only by the cloaked. One's not meant for ceremonial entry. Walked deeper and deeper, the light struggling to pierce the oppressive gloom. The journey was a disjunta physical dropping away from the sphere and its terrible stillness away from the high hall of ancient permanentias. He descended. The hypnotic quiet of the hall was replaced by a low, irregular rhythm, a sound that was at first mistaken for the beating of his own heart under stress, but it was too slow, too deep, too consistent. And vast, slow, mechanical pulse coming from the depths. Paused, leaning against the damp wall, the rough stone biting his shoulder, pulsing. Continued a single gigantic heartbeat, echoing in the earth. It was not natural, not geological. It was the sound of something immense and tireless. Working deep beneath the mountains, deep beneath the floor of the desert. What were the cloaked ones truly? Guarding not just the silence, not just the sphere, but whatever engine, whatever mechanism produced this low, persistent, rhythmic thrumming. Elias felt the mystery deepen like the shaft around him, extinguished his lamp briefly, wanting to heart sound. Without the distraction of light, darkness was total, velvety, overwhelming, and the heartbeat of the earth was clear. Now a slow, deep thump, a pause, then another thump, relit the lamp. The amber glow felt fragilely, a tiny bubble of warmth in a sea of cold truth. Knew he had to follow the sound. It was the only direction now. Sphere was the memory, the heartbeat was the power. Hurt continued his slow, treacherous descent. The passage twisting like the root of an old tree, the rhythmic pulse growing. Stronger Ludera vibration now felt in the bones of his feet, a steady, inexorable signal of profound hidden motion. Imagine the colossal wheel turning slowly, a machine of immense age maintaining some terrible balance seat that the cloaked ones had kept. Secret for all team, a secret that now called to him from the dark. The tunnel finally straightened, leading to a threshold. Air rushed past him, suddenly cold and fast, a deep, powerful current of wind rising from Belawand, and that wind carried on that. Chill breath was anew, set not dust, not ozone, not wet earth, but something metallic and sharp like fresh copper mixed with old, cold oil. Stood at the edge of the new chamber, light failing to penetrate the sheer size of the specie, pulsing. Sound was deafening hearing. He saw them shadows long. Silent figures moving in the distance, cloaked dark forms, attending to the machinier perhaps. Simply waiting in the endless darkness were too far to confirm they were the true cloaked ones they moved. Too slowly, too purposeful, like deep-sea fish in absolute zero. Lithe, shielded the lamp, peering into the abyss, wind whipping around him, threatening to extinguish the flame. And then he saw a brief flash of green. A light, not natural light, not firelight, a clean, cold emerald spark that vanished as quickly as it appeared in the mechanism deep in the heart of the thrumming Darkulius. Took one slow breath, the air tasting of secrets, and he wondered if those shadows were merely echoes of the past, or if the keepers had never truly left this cold, hushed velvet darkness. The dust shifted not the fine ochre powder of the true sand. See but a heavier, coarser grit of crushed black slate, and iron oxide staining the low-worn boots a deep rust color. Camel train lifted itself from the pre-dawn halt with a collective groan, a long protesting sound that traveled low along the chill ground, muffled and swallowed by the sudden rise of the foothills. This was the borderland, the jagged transition between endless rolling dunes and the colossal spine of the high. Mountains ahead months had passed since the great cities of the west, since the easy lushness of the cultivated fields. Now only stone remained, etched stone ancient and cold. The light was still. A bruise along the eastern horizon, a deep velvet blue, tinged with pale sickly green, where the new morning struggled to break through the residual darkness. Air here was thinner, crisper, carrying the scent of dry mountain herbs crushed underfoot. And the faint metallic tang of high-altitude cold, the rhythm resumed a deep, slow sway that had become the only constant in their lives. The only true measure of time, one foot lifted forward, a great padded foot sinking slightly into the heavy gravel. Then the next foot, and the next a methodical, tireless progression, moving always east, moving always slow. Listen to the weight of that silence, the hush between the steps. The sound of the bell on the leaf camel, a low, brassy, thrumming sound, perfectly timed, perfectly repetitive, a heartbeat for the moving world. Men cloaked against the cold dawn kept their heads down, scarves pulled high across their faces, leaving only narrow slits of tired eyes visible. They moved like figures carved from the surrounding environment, indistinguishable from the heavy shadows thrown by the low hills. Their movements economical, their energy conserved for the miles ahead. The ground rose steadily, subtly, a relentless uphill gradient that tested the endurance of the animals far more than the flat burning sand ever did. The camels leaned into the incline, their necks stretched low, their massive humps swaying heavily with the loads of silk and spice and dried fruit. Each step was an effort measured and deliberate. A silent pledge to the slow road. They had forgotten what quick movement felt like. They had forgotten the feeling of urgency or speed. Time here was elastic, stretching out across the horizon, measured only in the slow shift of the stars and the endless changing texture of the road under their feet. They were deep now in the great quiet, the long indifference of the interior, where human endeavors felt small and fleeting against the monumental scale of the geography. The sun finally cleared the ridge, flooding the scene not with heat, but with a sudden sharp amber light, taut the tiny mica flakes embedded in the gravel, making the path sparkle momentarily a brief flash of deceptive beauty before the road reverted to dull gray and brown. The shadows retreated, hugging the western slopes of the small stony knolls. The cold persisted, a stubborn presence refusing to yield to the weak morning sun. The vastness of the previous desert had been horizontal, a flat expanse that emphasized the sky. This vastness was vertical, a world defined by the looming stone mass pressing down from above, the great ancient bulk of the mountains drawing ever closer. The lead rider, Amir, did not look up. He did not need to see the mountains to know they were there. They lived inside the coldness of the air. They lived in the increased effort required by the caravan. They lived in the quality of the light. He focused only on the path immediately ahead, the 6 feet of rocky track visible between the ears of his lead beast, his mind empty save for the steady, hypnotic repetition of the travel. Left foot, right foot, bell, chime, gravel, scrape. Left foot, right foot, bell, chime, gravel, scrape. The rhythm of the journey was the rhythm of sleep, the slow, predictable movement, lulling the mind into a state of suspended awareness where past and future dissolved into the enduring present. Camels exhaled plumes of white mist into the chill air, each breath heavy and slow, the sound like gentle sighing, a long collective resignation to the journey. The men rode mostly in silence, speaking only in low measured tones when absolutely necessary to coordinate the turning of a load or to call for a brief water stop. Words seemed unnecessary here, a distraction from the fundamental task of existing and moving. The silence itself was heavy weighted with the accumulated history of centuries of travel across this same path. Every stone they'd passed was ancient, every fold in the earth was a record of unimaginable time. They were not just traveling through space, they were traveling through deep history, becoming of the slow sediment of the Silk Road. The slow hours passed indistinguishably. Amber light deepened into the harsh white glare of mid-morning, but the heat was different. Now a dry, penetrating warmth that did not scorch the skin, but simply dried the breath. They wound their way through a narrow defile, the walls rising steeply. On either side, rough-hewn stone streaked with black moss and pale mineral deposits. It was a passage through geological time, a slow immersion into the deep structure of the land. The sound of the wind changed here. It was no longer the broad sigh across open dunes, but a keening, whistling sound threading itself through the rock crevices. A high, lonely note that echoed the isolation of their position. Feeling of being cloaked in dust remained, though the dust itself was different. It was sharper, heavier, settling into the fibers of the wool and the canvas, giving everything a uniform layer of dullness. The colors of the silk, hidden beneath the protective wraps, retained their brilliance, but the outer world, the world of the traveler, was rendered entirely in shades of brown, gray, and tan. They stopped briefly near a small trickle of water emerging miraculously from a deep crack in the stone. Was glacial melt clear and stinging cold, a brief, refreshing contrast to the brackish water they often drank in the desert proper. The camels drank deeply, slowly, their long necks bowed towards the earth, the sound of their massive swallowing echoing off the closed walls of the ravine. The silence during the rest stop was profound, a sudden absence of the bell and the footstep, creating a momentary vacuum that felt enormous. No birds sang here, no insects buzzed on me. The slow, persistent drip of the melting water and the heavy, rhythmic chewing of the resting camels, their slow, steady cud work. A sound of absolute patience. Amir dismounted stiffly, his joints complaining after hours in the saddle. He walked the short line of the animals, checking the ropes, the tension of the loads, the condition of the pads. This inspection was another ritual of the slow road, a necessary distraction from the endless monotony of the travel. Everything must be secure, everything must endure, because there was no easy repair, no quick replacement out here, where the stone reigned supreme. He noticed the slight shift in the air temperature, the subtle feeling of higher elevation. The way his own breath was shallower. They were climbing, the world was literally lifting beneath their feet. The thought carried no drama, only a deep, hushed awareness of their vulnerability and their steadfast progress. They resumed the march, the pause only lasting long enough for the animals to drink their fill and the men to tighten their scarves. Shadow of the defile lengthened as the sun began its slow arc towards the west. The afternoon brought the characteristic desert mirage, not of water, but of distance. The end of the current valley always seemed impossibly far away. A shimmering line that receded as they approached this illusion was just another layer of the psychological endurance test the road imposed. You learn to ignore the horizon, to trust only the immediate ground beneath you. Learn to measure success not in arrival, but in the simple act of having taken the next required step. The path widened slightly, giving way to a high stony plain covered in low spiny brush and scattered fields of dark gray boulders. These boulders were colossal remnants of some ancient cataclysm. Scattered across the land like forgotten building blocks, they carried the wind and the silence, the history of this untouched world. The sound of the caravan now mingled with the slight rustle of the course. Brush disturbed by the passing feet, a delicate dry sound, a counterpoint to the heavy scrape of the gravel they moved towards. The deepest of the plain, aiming for a cluster of protective stone walls where they intended to make their evening camp. The light softened, turning from the harsh white of midday to a deep soft gold, the true amber light of late afternoon. Toward across the plain, casting the boulders in long dramatic shadows, stretching and warping the landscape into shapes of strange beauty. Air cooled rapidly, the temperature dropping noticeably as the sun dipped toward the western ridge. They felt the cold sinking into their bones, a cold that promised a frozen night. The camels picked up their pace, sensing the approaching halt, the rhythm of the bell slightly faster, slightly more insistent. They reached the stone enclosure, a low ring wall built ages ago by travelers before them, a small haven against the relentless wind and the night predators. Process of settling was slow, meticulous, predictable and loading. The packs carefully stacking the delicate silks in the center, laying out the low tents for protection against the night chill, feeding the animals. Every movement was practiced, refined over months of repetition, requiring no instruction, no hurried exchange of words. The sun finally vanished, a sudden drop behind the mountain edge, plunging the world instantly into twilight. The vast sky opened above them, a deepening velvet sheet dotted immediately with the first sharp pinpricks of light. The ancient stars emerged cold bright. Immense. Looking up at that sky, you understood the scale of the slow journey, the tiny fragile line they drew across the indifference of the earth. The fire was small, quickly built from dry mountain brush and dung, casting a low, flickering glow on the faces of the men. Sounds of the camp settled into a low hum, the quiet rustle of cloth, the clatter of metal pots, the steady breathing of the resting camels. Deep silence of the high interior settled around them, pressing close, hushed and absolute. The long day was over, the long journey continued, and in that profound quiet surrounded by the cold majesty of the etched stone mountains, the traveler found the slow, deep rest that only endless, repetitive motion can earn. The firelight shifted amber and gold against the dark canvas of the tents. Cold stars watched patiently above the slow breathing caravan, waiting for the inevitable moment when the bell would chime at dawn. Another day of slow and enduring travel earned, and gone another night of heavy, deep sleep demanded by the road itself. Sound of the wind outside the stone wall, a low, constant whisper telling tales of ancient movement and endless time. They had left the true heart of the terrible sands behind them, now the sand that scraped against the leather bindings of the burdens. It was a finer grain here, a pale dust rising in the hushed afternoon. Air forming phantom clouds that clung low to the horizon, a horizon that finally offered something other than gold and ochre monotony, a distant line of purple. Stone etched against the sky, the first promise of the great Kunlun mountain silent, ancient sentinels watching the slow, unending procession of man and beast. The camel hooves moved with a worn regularity, a steady, soft padding sound that muffled all conversation dragging. The heavy sledges of pressed brick tea and tightly wrapped bolts of deep velvet cloth towards the promised west. The heat was different now, less furnace blast, more simmering closeness. A humidity born of the distant river systems and the first signs of marshy alkali flats. They skirted carefully, following the narrow established track marked by generations of sun-bleached animal bones and broken pottery shards. The smell of dust gave way slowly to the scent of burnt dung fires from isolated settlements, and the sharp metallic tang of alkali and sweat, the rhythmic click of the iron bells hanging beneath the lead camel's chin, was the only true clock they knew, measuring the interminable hours and the steady, slow progress across the flattened earth. Sun dipped low, a final immense globe of amber fire, casting shadows that stretched miles long, transforming every ripple of sand into a mountainous ridge, every dwarf scrub bush into a towering monster. Drivers walked heads, bowed shoulders, slumped beneath the sheer weight of the slow accumulation of fatigue, months of sleeping on hard earth, months of unending dream, air, months where the only company was the sigh of the wind and the groan of the heavily burdened dromedaries. The last hour was always the hardest. The mind begging for rest, the body pushing through the final reserves, the destination a flickering mirage until it solidified into reality. Final hour of movement was cloaked in the long, lengthening shadows of the early evening sun, when the low mud brick walls of the great Khan Sirai finally became discernible, not as a mirage, but as a massive fortress of packed earth, as silent refuge against the immensity of the desert. This structure was centuries old, its foundations, settled deep into the desert floor stone, stacked upon stone, layer upon layer. A monumental achievement of patience and defensive architecture built to shelter. Hundreds of men and thousands of animals from the merciless elements and the opportunistic bandit. The sheer scale was overwhelming its gate, a massive dark aperture swallowed in shadow. A mouth leading into the temporary civilization they craved. They halted outside the walls, waiting for the officials to check the manifests and assess the caravan's health. The only sounds were the soft blowing of the weary camels, the low murmurs of the drivers, removing the heavy saddle frames, and the distant scraping sound of the gatekeepers pulling back the thick wooden bar, a deep resonant thud that echoed in the velvet stillness. Was a sound of profound relief. The opening of that gate meant water safety and a temporary halt to the endless marching. The caravan master Miesir rode forward, his face etched with exhaustion, his linen cloak dusted white with the fine loess of the trail. He spoke in low tones to the guards, exchanging documents. Wrapped tightly in oilskin, a ritual of entrance that had played out here daily for hundreds of years, a repetition of commerce and survival. The guards were local men, faces dark and weathered. Beneath heavy felt caps, their posture stiff, authoritative, they inspected the beasts running, practiced eyes over the humps, checking for sores or signs of debilitating sickness. They were meticulous, their slow movements mirroring the deliberate pace of the entire enterprise. One by one, the animals were led through the narrow arched gateway into the cavernous central courtyard. The transition was startling, from the open infinity of the desert to the cloaked intimacy of the Sarai. Interior, the courtyard was vast, a rectangle, defined by high unbroken walls of baked mud, brick offering perfect insulation against the night cold and the daytime sun. The center was the open sky, a diamond of darkening blue, now studded with the first faint stars. Ground was tamped earth, smooth and hard packed by the passage of uncountable feet and hooves. The air immediately felt heavier, thicker, laced with the mingled scents of old smoke, fresh water, hay, and the distinct dusty musk of hundreds of other animals already settled. They were not alone in the dim light filtering from the small oil lamps fixed to the walls. They could see other caravans already arrayed, their animals resting their goods. Stacked high in the covered alcoves that lined the perimeter, there were Turks, Mongols, Sogdians, Persians, all gathered here briefly before scattering across the routes. Task now was not rest, but the demanding work of settling the load. Every single package, every delicate bundle of raw silk, every chest of precious spices had to be carefully removed, catalogued, and stacked in a secure spot beneath the covered arcade. Camels sank gratefully to the ground, a collective sigh of relief vibrating through the courtyard. The men moved slowly without wasted energy, each movement learned and precise, the untying of the ropes, the lifting of the immense weight of the bales, the careful arrangement of the bundles so that they could breathe and not suffer spoilage. The silk bales were given the highest priority, stacked delicately on raised wooden pallets away from the damp earth, a measure against the subtle moisture that could ruin a year's profit in a single night. The soundscape shifted from the silence of the desert to the controlled noise of a resting population. The low whistle of a handler calming his animal, the clanking of a metal bucket being dropped into a deep well, the distant murmur of voices speaking in dozens of different tongues, none of it loud, none of it rushed. The water source was the most important feature of Visura, a deep cistern fed by an underground Qanat system bringing clean cold mountain water to this thirsty spot. The men queued patiently, forming a long silent line to draw the life, giving liquid first for the animals. Then, for themselves, the troughs were stone ancient basins, worn smooth by time, and used they filled. Slowly, deliberately, the water gleaming darkly in the shadows. The camels drank deeply, their long necks dipping rhythmically, the loud slurping sound cutting through the hushed evening air. This was the rhythm of the road, the moment of vulnerability. Giving way to the moment of necessary sustenance, Nasser assigned a rotation of guards to watch the goods, a standard precaution against opportunistic theft and misplacement. These men wrapped tightly in thick wool blankets sat quietly near the stacks, their eyes moving slowly over the shadows, their only weapon, their presence and vigilance for the main body of the drivers and laborers. The first luxury was the fire. Small designated areas in the courtyard were already glowing soft amber with banked coals. They did not cook anything elaborate tonight, only simple flatbread heated quickly, and a thin broth made from dried preserved meats and vegetables. Sustenance designed for quick energy and warmth. The smoke rose straight and blue in the still air, carrying the faint scent of juniper and dry wood. The act of eating was communal but silent, fueled purely by exhaustion. They sat close together, not speaking, conserving all energy, their minds already drifting towards the deep sleep that awaited above them. The architecture of the sarai provided a sense of immense protective history. The walls were not mere fences, they were structures of permanence built to withstand siege, flood, and the unrelenting passage of centuries. Every stone, every brick was imbued with the memory